There was a glow and falling debris, and it was said that a century ago the skies had opened up and dungeons had appeared. 4 giant monsters were seen, and it was explained that the monsters that came out of the dungeons were impossible to defeat with normal weapons, and there were only those who could fight them. A man in a purple robe appeared, and it was said that this could be done by people whose supernatural abilities had awakened in their bodies at the same time as the dungeons appeared. The 3 awakened ones rejoiced over their victory over the monsters, and it turned out that thanks to them the world had become stable. The common people raised their hands in joy, and it was said that while the monsters, mana, and new civilization were taking root, some of the awakened ones became hunters whose job was to destroy these creatures, and after tens of years, something appeared. The awakened ones widened their eyes in surprise when they heard the question about whether there were too many hunters. From a small, insecure wimp, John turned into a cool awakened who would definitely not go unnoticed, and an explanation appeared that once the secret mechanism was revealed, it became possible to artificially awaken people so that anyone who had enough money for it could use it. On the phone screen, news about hunters and a happy ending for a professional hunter appeared, and it turned out that the number of people wanting to become hunters was also increasing. The eyes of a man in a white shirt were blurred, and he asked if anyone wanted to become a hunter, to which he received the answer that they did. The dawn of the great era of hunters had arrived, and a blue magical portal appeared, near which people were pushing, trying to get forward. Because obvious problems began, the government came into the scene and established a professional exam, and only those who passed it were allowed to become an active hunter. A teacher appeared among the sheets of paper, and it was announced that educational institutions had appeared that prepared for passing the exams. The guy was doing squats with a barbell, and the story continued about how they provided the necessary information and trained students. The man with the book raised his hand, and it turned out that eventually private institutes appeared that trained future professionals in their field, and they were called hunter academies. A cough was heard, and drops of blood appeared. Standing in front of a giant dragon, the protagonist asked how such a person could exist. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist asked if he was a frog in a well. The monster swung its tail. The dragon opened its mouth wide, and the guy said that he refused to accept it. The monster's claws appeared, and Sajin muttered that in order to become a hunter, you now need to attend an academy. The guy struck the monster and killed it. The protagonist's magic staff left a trail cutting through the air. A bright magical light was visible in the stones. Opening its mouth, the dragon released dark forces directly at the protagonist. Sajin put the spear on his shoulders and looked up. Holding the spear forward, the protagonist recalled the instructions of each professor and explained that the institution he was going to was in a completely different dimension than all the others. It seemed like black fragments were falling. Closing his eyes, the protagonist walked away from the dead monster. Taking the phone in his hand, Sajin smiled. A question appeared asking if the guy wanted to sign up for a class, to which the protagonist wondered which class he should go to. The hero swiped his finger, and the protagonist answered the question in the affirmative. A notification appeared that the class was starting, and gratitude to the students for choosing the Academy of Transcendence. The confused face of 27-year-old Sajin with a helmet on his head appeared. Holding the straps of the load with his hands, the protagonist explained that he was awakened naturally, given more strength than others at birth, and continued that in order to pay off the debts of his parents who died in an accident shrouded in mystery, he has been transporting slain monsters for 9 years. Placing his hand on the bag with the monster's body, Sajin explained that there is only one thing that helps him endure such hard work and the psychological pressure of death. Wiping his face with a towel, the protagonist thought about his dream of becoming a professional hunter. The protagonist's colleague held out a glass and offered him a rest, asking how Sajin was doing with becoming a hunter and how he was doing with money. To which he replied that he was still looking for a good academy, but there weren't many inexpensive ones. And another man asked if the guy could become a hunter at least because he was awakened, and received the answer that the hunter exam had been instituted 50 years ago, and attending the academy was now mandatory. There was no way to shirk. Raising the drink to his mouth, Sajin understood that this was true, because most of the teachers in these academies were active hunters who shared their experience, taught cool skills that you need to know before risking your life. Behind the heroes, a sign was visible stating that the Hunter Academy was seeing a record number of applications. The guy who graduated from the academy turned away from the common man, and it was said that because of this, a huge gap formed between the uneducated and the academy graduates, because the time had come when it was necessary to study at the appropriate institution in order to become a hunter. Sajin, happily looking at the phone, realized something. The protagonist's balance appeared on the phone screen, and he realized that now he had enough money for a year of study at the academy. Colleagues turned around at the sound of the protagonist's phone, and he muttered that he wanted to go to better places, but they were too expensive, and this place was not so bad. Advertisements began to arrive on the protagonist's phone, to which he, surprised, thought that this was the first time he heard about the Transcendent Academy. Gautama gestured with his fingers, saying that the paradigm had shifted and a transcendental fury was about to strike the universe, and all experience and knowledge had been selected by teachers who were over 10,000 years old. It turned out that each student had to complete an individual test, and the student who had passed the 9th grade Swordmaster exam said in an interview that he had registered here with no expectations, but joining this academy had been the best decision of his life. Following this, the student who had passed the 5th grade Sage Ascension exam thanked the academy in an interview with a wide smile. Saju's phone continued to receive advertisements for admission and grateful reviews about the academy, and it was said that he too could become one of them. A bright glow appeared on the phone screen. The protagonist looked at it in bewilderment. Saju's eyes turned white, and he wondered what kind of crazy person had created this advertisement. While browsing the academy's website, the protagonist said that their website was the same as any other academy, and all the teachers had weird names. Then his gaze was caught by the Professor Great Sage, and Sajun wanted to see what a teacher with such a name was like. The Great Sage appeared, waving his hand. Sunukun greeted the protagonist and said that his main weapon was the Rui staff, but sticks and spears were not much different from it, to which Sajun, putting his hand to his face, was surprised that the teacher was a monkey. Holding the phone in his hands, the protagonist said that the lesson looked normal, given its concept, and Sunukun said in the video that it was difficult to understand the theoretical explanation. Swinging his staff, the Great Sage first used the deflecting movement skill and then dispersal. The enemy appeared, and the teacher explained that then you need to rotate the staff back inward and use the grab. A blue magical glow appeared, and Sunukun finished the story by saying that at the end you need to pierce the enemy with one move at a certain point using the pierce skill. Sajun asked with his mouth wide open what it was and did not understand where the mountain had disappeared to. The protagonist, holding the phone in his hands, shouted that this did not look like CGI, and that it was impossible even for S-class hunters. In front of the protagonist, an offer to sign up for a class taught by a great sage appeared. Sajun looked at the phone screen with his lips down. The protagonist pointed his finger at the sign-up button for the class, but an error appeared because the protagonist is not a member of the academy, and then an offer to register an account and pay a membership fee, to which Sajun was indignant that even creating an account costs money. A notification about paying a registration membership fee of 40,000 appeared. The protagonist brought the phone screen closer to his face and looked at the amount of the fee. Seeing the figure of 40,000, the protagonist put the phone away from himself. The cloudy sky was visible and Sajun's scream could be heard that they were damn charlatans. Carrying the corpse of a monster on his shoulder, the colleague asked the guy if he was going to enroll in the academy. The man placed the body on the protagonist's back and said that this is why the protagonist is in such a good mood and asked what kind of institution it was, to which Sajun replied that it was called the Ark and the teachers there were pretty cool. A special hook was lifting the body of a large monster, and the colleague asked the protagonist not to forget him when he got rich, to which Sajun agreed and asked if the man would be dealing with the monsters he caught, to which the colleague replied that it sounded great, and would he finally get a dragon. Raising his hand, the protagonist said that not only that, but the colleague would even be able to play soccer with a skull. Sajun appeared, carrying the monsters' bodies to a pile, and it was said that someone once said that life seems like a comedy from afar and a tragedy when you look closer. The chain with the big monster broke, and someone called out to the protagonist. There was a bandage on Sajun's face, and it was said that in order to laugh sincerely, one must accept one's pain. The doctor, with his lips pressed together, said that the protagonist had nerve necrosis in his legs, and suggested that the broken bones were enveloped in nerves during the healing process, and all this was due to rapid regeneration since the protagonist was awakened. The head of the enterprise, throwing up his hands, shouted that there would be no compensation, and asked what would happen to his nephew's reputation and his own if the world found out about what happened at their enterprise. A medical lamp illuminated the room, and the doctor said that the operation would cost 40,000. The doctor explained that the operation needed to be performed as soon as possible. If they waited a little longer, the nerves would permanently attach to the bones, and they would be unable to help in any way, then asked the protagonist to take the envelope, and it was said that therefore one must be able to look far into the future. The protagonist sat on the hospital bed with his mouth slightly open and said that he was looking into the future while he endured this hellish labor for 9 years. Unfolding the envelope, Sajun noticed that all his savings had been spent on the surgery, and all he had left was the 3,000 that Manchel had given him, the damn 3,000. A notification came to the protagonist's phone, and he wondered if he could go through this again. The protagonist looked at his phone in confusion. The screen displayed messages about new students being able to take advantage of a special offer and get an absolutely free pass, to which Seojun thought that this was the same Transcendent Academy. The protagonist scrolled through the messages and thought that after that day, he could not find it again, and a notification appeared saying that the guy's registration fee would be calculated taking into account his situation. The registration membership fee was 3,000. To which Seojun, with his lips pressed together, was confused and wondered if the last time it was 40,000. The protagonist's lips turned down, realizing that the 40,000 was all he had back then, and he decided that they wanted to take everything from him. Smiling, the protagonist thought why not try to register since there was nothing on the account anyway. A message came that the membership was confirmed, and Seojun, with his mouth open in fear, watched the money fly out of the envelope, after which a congratulatory notification came about entering the academy. A magical creature appeared from the protagonist's phone, and he did not understand what was happening. The creature said that it was glad to meet him, and asked if the guy was Seojun, to which he looked down, his mouth slightly open. The creature explained that it was the protagonist's mentor, and was in charge of primary education, to which the protagonist, with his mouth wide open, thought he had hit his head. With his purple eyes widened, the mentor introduced himself. The assistant smiled, and the protagonist began to speak. Seojun pursed his lips and muttered what the assistant had said. The boy continued that his mentor's name was Mentor, to which the creature jumping on the phone screen replied that it was, indeed, him. Putting his hands on his hips, the assistant said that his mentor was him, and his name was Mentor. Looking away, Seojun clarified that maybe Mentor was Odysseus' teacher, to which the hero of Greek mythology was surprised that the protagonist knew him, and the assistant replied that he was the first student he had mentored, and since Odysseus became a transcendent, a lot of time had passed, but he still occasionally got in touch. Frowning, Mentor explained that in any case, their academy trains those who want to go beyond the limits of their race. Seojun's eyes widened in confusion. Leaning on his hands, the protagonist clarified that this academy is for transcendents, not hunters. The mentor placed his hands on the phone and asked how they could even be compared since they were on a completely different level. The protagonist raised his hand and started talking about S-class hunters while the assistant pressed buttons on the phone. The mentor held the phone up to Seojun's face and explained that their instructors were capable of taking out hunters with just one finger, no joke, and asked the protagonist to fill out something. A transcendental aptitude test appeared on the phone screen. The protagonist scratched his head and asked what it was, to which the little mentor replied that this way they would see what kind of transcendent he wanted to become, as well as his current level and inclinations, to which Seojun sighed. The protagonist chose the answer to the first question, and the mentor added that he needed to answer as honestly as possible so that he would receive the best recommendations, but the boy still didn't understand what was going on. Seojun reached his finger towards the phone screen. Suddenly he stopped, to which the assistant, with his mouth slightly open, asked if there was a problem. Clutching his head, the protagonist said that he did not know what to choose in the second question about his skill level, to which the mentor encouraged him that many doubted this, and suggested that he choose something that literally reflected the guy's abilities. Raising his leg, the little assistant asked if Seojun could clear a plane with his strongest blow, to which he replied that he could not. The mentor asked if his young friend was capable of splitting a mountain in two with one jerk, to which the protagonist, looking down, replied that he could only climb it. Turning to face the protagonist, the mentor clarified that he would not be able to pull it out of the ground, to which the guy said that it sounded even stranger. Throwing his hand behind his head, Seojun continued to be surprised by the questions, and the creature did not understand how he managed to register for their academy, because he was an incompetent. The mentor winked and encouraged the boy by saying that it was nothing to worry about, because the Transcendent Academy would never expel its student. Once a member, it would remain a member forever, and then asked Seojun to continue answering questions. The little assistant, clapping his hands, praised the protagonist. The exhausted protagonist finally finished and put the phone down, after which he asked why there were 108 questions. The mentor said that the boy had a free pass and decided to recommend him a few mandatory lectures, after which he suggested discussing everything else after they analyzed his profile, to which Seojun, putting his hand to his forehead, agreed. A spear appeared, and the assistant said that the protagonist's preferred method of fighting was fighting with a spear. Mentor put his hand to his chin and mused that instead of cultivating mana, it would be better to choose the Eastern technique of Kai for wielding a spear, and added that the great celestial sage was best suited for learning the basics, but it would be too difficult for the hero. Notifications for 2 training courses from instructors Gautama and Chiron appeared, and the assistant said that he thought this would be the best solution for a free pass. Mentor clarified whether it was true that in addition to his wounds, the guy had mental problems, to which he lowered his eyebrows and looked ahead. The small assistant sat on the protagonist's shoulder and suggested starting with instructor Gautama's lecture, to which the protagonist repeated the teacher's name. A question was heard in the room about whether the creature was talking about Buddha, to which the mentor replied that the instructor denies it, but all the students address him that way. The teacher's face appeared, and mentor said that due to his lectures on psychology, he is one of the most famous instructors and his subject is required for the exam, and added that usually a huge amount of money is required to attend this lecture, but Gautama is very insistent on saving poor souls, to which Sajin asked what the hell. A notification appeared that upon completing the lesson, he will receive the unwavering heart. The protagonist did not understand what this meant, and the little assistant explained that this is the reason why this lecture is necessary, because it can help to succeed in almost any direction of transcendence. Winking, the mentor explained that even if he felt like he was going crazy, he should definitely watch the lecture to the end, to which the protagonist asked him again, and he replied that the guy would understand everything when it started. The little assistant disappeared in a pink glow and said that he would contact the protagonist after analyzing his profile, to which Sajin asked him to stop. Covering his legs with a blanket, the protagonist realized that he would have to look at this lecture, after which a notification appeared that he needed to press a button to start watching. Gautama closed his eyes and asked the listeners' opinions on whether their world existed. Holding the phone in his hands, Sajin wondered if this was really Buddha because he looked like a living golden statue. The mentor grinned and said that the word I did not exist, therefore he himself did not exist, and it was heard that more importantly, this lecture was too difficult. Gautama placed his hand on his knee and said that if they had nothing to compare it to, then how could they exist and what could not be defined? Sajin, floating in space, asked if this was what Mentor was talking about and continued to listen to the lecture about how this world and the entire universe were thus created the moment they were born. The silhouette of Buddha appeared against the backdrop of space, and he continued to say that the world and the universe would perish when they died because they did not exist and they were the world. The protagonist thought that he felt like he was starting to go crazy when suddenly a notification came that the lecture was 0.06% complete. Sajin was lying on his bed and the sun was shining in his room. A week later, a hospital building appeared, from which the doctor could be heard marveling at the speed of the protagonist's recovery. Adjusting his glasses, the man looked at the muscular body of the protagonist and said that he of course understood that the guy was awakened, but in 30 years of work he saw something like this for the first time. Sajin smiled and realized that he hadn't imagined it. The protagonist was lying on the bed and thought that thanks to Gautama's lesson, his heart had found peace, which increased the speed of recovery. Although when he listened to the lecture, it seemed that his mind was leaving him, and added that the lesson was only 1.3% complete, but the effect was already amazing. Looking at the documents, the doctor warned that you never know what might happen, and suggested that the protagonist stay in the hospital for another week or two, to which he thought about what would happen when he finished listening to the lecture. Smiling widely, Sajin agreed with the doctor, and decided to do as he said, and thought that the Academy of Transcendence was no joke. The protagonist was scrolling through messages on his phone and decided to watch Chiron's lecture at the same time, since he could now move his body. Crossing his legs, the protagonist thought that Class of Metamorphosis was lower in rank compared to Steadfast Heart, but it was far from a low-level skill. Remembering Mentor's words about Steadfast Heart, Sajin realized that most likely this skill was simply too powerful. Chiron's face appeared. He said that it was nice to meet you and introduced himself. The silhouette of a centaur was visible, and it was said that the mentor was a creature with a human torso and the lower body of a horse. Silhouettes of heroes of Greek mythology appeared against the background of space, and it was explained that Chiron was the teacher of almost all of them. Putting his hand on his hip, the mentor indicated that the purpose of this lecture would be to prepare the students to the stage where they could move on to the early levels of transcendence. The teacher asked to note that in this course, martial techniques would be covered superficially, to which Sajin, smiling, admitted that he was almost surprised that this was the real Chiron. Putting his hand to his chin, the centaur began to talk about the first step to becoming a transcendent. Taking the phone away from his eyes, the protagonist looked ahead questioningly. It seemed like someone bared their teeth angrily. A man with bright blue eyes shouted for the protagonist to quickly get up and go. Dropping the phone from his hands, the protagonist screamed loudly in fear. The protagonist's face became very round. Lying on the floor, the protagonist heard the sound of a notification on his phone. Signs about a new daily task appeared. The guy picked up the phone and was surprised. Standing on his feet, he asked if this would be every day. Lowering his eyebrows, Sajin remembered that the doctor said to try not to overexert himself for the next week. Yawning, the protagonist said that for now he would just listen to lectures, and he would study when he was discharged, and an uncompleted task was discovered. The protagonist poked at the screen with satisfaction and the same sign popped up again. Sitting on the bed, he did not understand how they knew that he did nothing. The guy's hair turned white. Lowering his head, he thought that everything was lost. But a week would not solve anything, there was no need to drive yourself. Looking at the Buddha, Sajin decided to listen to the lectures first. He noticed a sign that the free pass would end in 83 days. Running out into the street, the protagonist clarified whether it was given for a while. A lamppost was visible, and he continued that the Academy of Transcendence is also an academy, and it is logical that not everything is free for them. Stretching his legs, the guy said that there were 83 days left, and apparently initially 90 days are given, and he did not know how this academy works, but it seems that in order to increase progress, he must absorb knowledge and reach a certain level of understanding. Taking the smartphone in his hands, the protagonist did not understand why everything was unchanged. His pupils turned white, and he thought that he had listened to the Buddha's lecture over and over again for a whole week, but his progress remained the same. Sungjun exhaled, doubting that he would be able to complete the course in the remaining days. Moving his shoulder, he asked if the free pass was some kind of trial period, adding that he had not trained for a long time, and before this, he did not see the point in training at all. Starting with push-ups, he said that after all, he had been carrying monsters killed by hunters for 9 years. Remembering the work, the protagonist said that the monsters weighed about 70 kilograms, so he did not need additional exercises. His sweat dripped onto the asphalt, and he said to himself that although he did not know how to use magic, he was still awakened, and he was confident in his physical strength. After 300 push-ups, he knocked the dust off his hands. The main character raised his hand to his forehead and said that compared to years of grueling work, this was nothing, and decided to see what happened next. He didn't understand why his push-ups weren't counted in full. Raising his eyebrows, the guy asked why only 81. He continued training. His counter didn't change. Sajin started shaking. 1 point was added. He stood up and picked up his smartphone. Gritting his teeth, he said that they weren't perfect, and completed the task. The guy did all the pull-ups. The press and squats were also done. Having run 30 kilometers, he exclaimed how this even works. The main character looked at the screen. Lying on the floor, he screamed that this was some kind of madness, he couldn't take it anymore, and the people around him judged him. From the hospital came the question of whether it was necessary to do this every day, and when to listen to lectures, having received the answer that it was not his problem. A couple of days later, the grandmother showed up. Sajin put his hands in his pockets and heard that he was getting better every day, and whether he was training again, to which he said yes, and how she was doing. The old lady, stretching out her palms, said that she was working hard. The guy's eyes widened from the news that at 5 o'clock in the morning a level 4 monster was discovered in Seoul. Looking at the reporter, he continued to listen to the association claim that he was in hibernation, which, as it turned out, the transportation service did not know, so the monster ended up in the city center, where it woke up from sleep. They showed a hunter, and the host added that many could have died. The protagonist, with his pupil bulging, heard that by pure chance, an awakened one was nearby, who repelled the attack of the monster. The main character stood with his hands down, and the reporter said that he was a student of the Gaon Academy, and the granny said that the hunters saved them again. She, opening her mouth, said that they are great people. Looking at the youth, she asked if he was awakened, receiving a positive answer. Taking his hand, the old woman asked if he was a hunter, would they show him on TV. Lowering his eyebrows, Sajin wondered if she thought that the news showed just anyone. The man held a newspaper and turned to them. The granny, narrowing her pupils, listened to how it was very difficult to become a hunter now, a 1 in a million chance, and asked if this was true, how everything had changed. In her time it was different. The stranger, opening his mouth, turned to the student. Putting his elbow on the armrest, he said that he did not even study at the academy. He was just wasting his time training. He would not become a hunter, he should give up. Remembering past moments, the main character listened to the words so as not to waste his youth on unrealistic dreams. He frowned. Granny scolded the man with her finger, and he said that he wanted to help. The old man, hearing that he would decide for himself what to do, became very angry. The protagonist, opening his mouth wide, added that he should get on with his life and that no one should interfere with his. Sweat ran down the stranger's cheek. Clenching his fist, he shouted that they should just look at this rude man, and by the way, it is worth listening to the advice of elders. As he left, the guy thought that this was nonsense. He was a student at the Academy of Transcendence and had already felt the effect of the training in a week, and here he could become a professional hunter. The guy exhaled menacingly. He, running along the road, added that he would definitely become one. A girl appeared and she covered her mouth, saying that she was tired of being a hunter. She, fighting monsters, did not understand the point of this academy. Striking blows, she continued that everything costs money, there are almost no students. The huntress plunged her sword into the monster. Standing on its remains, she said that it was possible to die of boredom. A bloody paw lay on the ground. A small building appeared. Sajin, jumping onto the bed, was glad to have his home. The doctor adjusted his glasses and asked if it was only 2 weeks. The guy, resting his head on his hand, said that he had been in the hospital for 2 whole weeks, and his apartment was small, but the best. The protagonist's pupils bulged. Watching the drops drip, he thought that there was still a year until the hunter's exam. The bag was lying by the door and he clarified how much money was left in the account. The protagonist was visible through the bars on the window. He, opening his mouth, realized that he had nothing at all. Taking the phone, Sajin said that he had already finished the assignment. Running his finger across the screen, he thought that he had not had time to watch the lectures, because the next day was already starting and maybe today would be possible. A notification appeared about the start of the next lesson. Chiron, stroking his beard, said that it was excellent. The guy, standing up, heard that it seemed like he had finally learned to walk and asked if he considered him a baby. The teacher of heroes, holding a spear in his hand, answered that in that case it was time to take the first steps, the first step on the path to becoming a transcendent. Lowering his eyebrows, the teacher uttered the word feelings. The lecture was completed at 5.7%. The next morning, a construction site was visible and it was heard that he thought that he needed some kind of complex operation, but it turned out to be some kind of trifle. The worker, folding his arms, said that he was deprived of intelligence since he decided to come back here and let him know that if this happens again, he will not get off so easily, and the protagonist thought that he did not want to come back, but he had no choice. The main character, squinting his eyes, said to himself that, apparently, he felt guilty, albeit a little. A container with windows was visible. Xiaojun, sitting on a bench, exclaimed that it all came down to money. If he didn't work, he wouldn't have anything to eat, and if he worked, he wouldn't have time to study. Closing his eyes, the guy continued that if he didn't do his daily assignment, he wouldn't be able to listen to Chiron's lectures. Through the sweat on his face, he wondered if he should at least review the previous classes and what Chiron had said in the last lecture, remembering that something about feelings. His workmate, with his mouth slightly open, heard that 5 senses play a key role in combat, namely sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, all the familiar 5 senses. The protagonist's colleague looked at him. The hero's teacher, folding his hands, added that first they perceive the stimulus, then they recognize it and then draw a conclusion, but this is too slow and he will teach them how to speed up this process as much as possible. With his jaw wide open, he continued that they would learn something completely different from these 5 senses, hidden in them. The protagonist, his eyes wide, listened to the end that the 6th sense was intuition. Xiaojun's comrade, enticed, exclaimed that he should have at least warned them that he was coming, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. He made a surprised face. The protagonist frowned. The builder, holding his fist, asked if he had eyes on his back, how he dodged. Shouts could be heard from outside. What are they doing here? They came to work, so they should work. The colleague, with dilated pupils, asked if he could handle it. There were at least 200 kilograms here. The guy, smiling, replied that it was okay, let him load it. He was carrying the remains of the monster on his back. The workers looked at him in surprise. The protagonist's comrade, with his mouth slightly open, thought that he was lively, and it seemed that everything was really alright with him, and it was heard that they would continue after the break. The protagonist, clenching his fist, did not understand why he felt as if the strength was overflowing him. Xiaojun, squatting, said that he could do his daily task, there would be no time after work anyway. Wiping away the sweat, he said that he would check if he was doing everything correctly. The protagonist's pupils narrowed. He saw that one squat was counted as 3. The guy, standing still, realized that it was because of the extra everything increased in efficiency, and his comrade shouted that he should rest. The protagonist, raising the corners of his lips, said that it was great, and the conversations of the workers were heard. Xiaojun, grabbing pieces of meat, exclaimed that why allocate time for exercise if he could train during work. While doing push-ups, he added that the more weight, the less to do. Words appeared in the sky that you can work and spend time usefully, kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and the protagonist began to do pull-ups, and his colleague shouted that he would overexert himself. The guy, lying on the bed, said that he was going to die. Remembering his work, he said that combining work and classes turned out to be very effective, but very difficult, and who would think of training and dragging monsters at the same time? The protagonist sat down. He looked at the phone. Looking at the completed tasks, he realized that he had saved a lot of time. The protagonist, tucking his legs, said that it was only 10 o'clock and he had already listened to both lectures, and it was good that he had finished so quickly, but he felt that he was wasting his time. Running his finger across the screen, Sajin wondered whether he should watch it again. Holding his chin, he continued that it might be better to sign up for another course, and apparently, rewatching does not affect progress, and the idea is not bad. Sheet free pass, he decided to choose something else. He noticed Professor Xiangu's lesson. The boy widened his eyes and asked if he was talking about the same hegemon king. Imagining him riding a horse, the boy said that he was the legendary ruler of Western Chu, known for his superhuman strength, and it was not for nothing that they say about him that one can go against 7. Seeing the registration plate, he added that it sounded good, and besides, it was free. Xiangu, opening his mouth wide, shouted that since he signed up for this cruise, He was just a loser who did not even know the basics, and he was a non-entity who wanted to wield a spear. The protagonist, hearing these words, sweat began to flow. The hegemon king, holding a spear in his hand, exclaimed that he would teach him. All the simpletons could be free. The daily task boards appeared and the man continued that you just need to swing the spear, feel it with every cell of your body, let them understand it, and then come back. Sajin lifted his smartphone and was surprised by the new task. Hitting his leg, the protagonist asked if he had said only a couple of sentences and if this was the whole lecture. A notification was visible on the screen and Xiangyu said that if he wanted to master the spearman's skill, he just needed to swing the spear. While in the apartment, the protagonist did not understand why all the tasks were like this. The manager, looking at the girl, said that they had not had a single accident at their production facility, all thanks to safety precautions. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. Hunter-san, opening her mouth, asked if they had heard about the giant who had awakened the other day. She personally made sure of his death, but she would still like to conduct a thorough check in case they had missed something. The man, raising his hands, agreed. The head of the monster appeared on the guy's bag and the workers said that he was practically crawling on his knees in front of her. Sungjun, his eyes wide, thought that maybe she was the granddaughter of the Star Sword. Minchel appeared, who was in a blue aura. An unusual glow was visible and it was said that 100 years ago he was one of the awakened who received his power at the moment the gate opened. Monsters attacked people and the guy continued that back then they knew practically nothing about the awakened, and the evil spirits were more cruel and could roam the streets unhindered. The mother held onto her child and the protagonist added that there was no complete certainty that humanity would be able to survive. The Star Sword dealt a crushing blow to the monster. The child looked at the hero. Minchel was visible. He was one of the few awakened. He held a sword in his hand and the protagonist said that he did not allow their civilization to disappear. He is a true savior of the world and a hero. Imagining himself standing, leaning on the weapon, the protagonist added that a lot of time had passed since then. He was already quite old, but still a heavyweight in his field, capable of competing with anyone. Sungjun closed his eyes. He lifted his load and said as if he cared. Si-yoon, putting her hand on her side, asked what he was doing, receiving an answer that she should not pay attention to him. He had been like this for a week. Adjusting her hair, the girl thought that he had gone crazy and the guy was counting. The protagonist's comrade heard that the guy would throw the corpses here and continued counting. Looking at the monster's hand, the man lowered his eyebrows. He, putting his hands on the table, asked when he would calm down, to which the protagonist replied that since he had started the course, he needed to find out how it would end. The open mouth of the evil spirit was visible. Sungjun, opening his mouth, said that there was a point to these activities, and his friend did not understand what the point was. The worker, frowning, exclaimed that he would kick the bucket so soon, and since he had dragged it here, he should get out of here, and the guy said that he would bring more. The comrade stood by the table and grinned. He put his hand on his side. The protagonist, turning around, heard something. The monster jumped out of the pile of meat. It opened its mouth fiercely. The protagonist, wide-eyed, was shocked. Xiangyu yawned from boredom. The boss, rubbing his palms, said that the granddaughter of the Star Sword had no place in such a backwater. It was better to discuss everything in their cool office, to which the girl replied that everything was fine. She, standing by the iron beam, thought that she had finally escaped from there. She did not like their boss. The worker, standing in the corner, overheard how much longer she had to endure all this. Looking at her, he said whether she really was Minchel's granddaughter. Xiangyu, closing her eyes, heard the workers talking. She, folding her hands, said to herself that for many, the Star Sword is a hero, but for her this name is a burden, a label that she cannot get rid of. Remembering herself in her youth, she continued that her grandfather taught her how to be a hunter since she was in diapers, but the bar he set was too high, and she simply could not overcome it. Holding a stick in her hands, she added that she had been compared to her grandfather hero all her life, but her real dream was to teach people. She, stretching out her fingers, shouted that she wanted to be a teacher, but Minchel did not want to hear it. He, turning away, told her not to bring up this topic again, to which the girl thought that because she was his granddaughter, she could not live a normal life, but they came to a compromise, and she founded an academy of hunters. The students, opening their mouths, clarified whether that same Star Sword would really teach them. Xiangyu, holding a paper in her hands, answered that her grandfather had nothing to do with it. She would be the teacher, receiving the answer that they were deceived. She, wide-eyed, did not understand what was going on. The light fell on her and the granddaughter continued that when it turned out that her grandfather did not teach at her academy, everyone immediately lost interest and left. She clenched the documents, scattering them. The girl said that they only wanted the Star Sword, but not her. Walking through the Enterprise, she thought that even the few that remained left the academy after her grandfather's threats, and therefore no one knows about her now. Squeezing her fist, Xiangyu wanted to have at least one worthy student. One of the workers, his mouth open, shouted for everyone to run. The granddaughter, hearing about the monster, lowered her eyebrows. Sungjun looked at his comrade with concern. He clenched his jaw, not understanding why the monster suddenly came to life. His colleague, lying on the floor, shouted for him to run. Hearing that the protagonist should forget about him and let him save himself, he, lowering his hands, realized that he would be killed. The protagonist narrowed his pupils and repeated that he would definitely be killed. Introducing the evil spirits, he said that an ordinary person would never defeat the monster, as would an awakened person who was unable to use magic, and this was something of the 4th level with which even a professional would have a hard time. The guy remembered that there was a hunter named Xiangyu. He took a thick pipe and understood that it would not be in time, he would simply be bitten to death. Seeing his friend, he said that they needed to act right now, and someone had to do something urgently, otherwise he would not be saved. The monster licked its mouth with its tongue. Sungjun, slightly opening his mouth, wondered who could. The monster opened its mouth. The protagonist swung the pipe. He, running, threw his backpack. The protagonist fiercely raised his weapon. He scared the monster away. Standing in front of the enemy, the guy shouted for his comrade to run faster. The colleague, lowering his eyebrows, asked how he could do it, having received the answer that then they would both be eaten. Taking a fighting stance, Sungjun realized that he was alone and needed to hold out until the hunters arrived. He directed his gaze at the monster. The protagonist, continuing to hold the iron bar, said to himself that there was no need to be afraid, that he needed to control himself and not stand like a pillar. Raising his eyelashes, he remembered Gautama's words that he was the universe, let him observe the world. Imagining water beneath him, the protagonist heard a voice that he needed to know the origins, his essence. These were the words of Buddha. The evil spirits began to approach. Gautama, appearing behind the guy, said for him to embrace the entire universe and think about where it was moving, and Sungjun rejected his emotions. The monster pushed off the ground with its paw. It ran towards the protagonist. The protagonist ran and realized that then his wildly beating heart would calm down on its own. The monster had long claws. It struck. The fighter, imagining Chiron, heard his words that he should not think, but move, otherwise it might be too late. He would have to trust his instincts. The guy dodged the attack. He jumped back. The enemy began to swing his tail. Sungjun pushed off the floor with the help of a pipe. He flew high into the sky and said that you need to rely on your feelings. The beast growled fiercely. The protagonist, tumbling, saw a blind spot. Raising his eyebrows, he did not understand when to attack and what to do. Xiangyu, folding his arms, said that in order to lift a mountain, strength alone is not enough, you need courage and zeal. The protagonist, lowering his head, listened that he needed to trust them. He was able to break the mountain in half, and he should not dare to doubt himself. The awakened raised his hands up. His eyes left shining traces, and he decided that he could cut it. Looking at the monster, the protagonist added that he simply had to. The monster stood on all fours. It showed its fangs, and it sounded like a force capable of moving a mountain, tearing it out of the ground. Sungjun's eyes turned white. He delivered a slashing blow. A powerful explosion occurred. Xiangyu, running past the workers, clarified what was happening there and what kind of explosion it was. Her pupils dilated. The girl saw the protagonist. He cut the enemy in half. The protagonist bit the corners of his lips. Sweat was running down his face. Clutching his head, the guy said that it really worked. A tablet appeared with the progress of lectures, which increased. Minchel's granddaughter wondered what happened here. Seeing Sungjun standing on the head of the beast, she added that some loader, who didn't even study at the academy, dealt with such a monster with a beam instead of a normal weapon. The guy's mouth dropped open. He ran past Xiangyu and shouted about Mr. Taking his hands, the protagonist began to ask if he was okay, if he was injured, to which he replied that everything was fine. The leader, rubbing his palms, said that they really checked, but it seemed that they made a little mistake. And the words of the protagonist were heard that they themselves knew how much he had been training lately. It was better to go to the hospital, just in case. The loaders stroked his head. Xiangyu, her eyes wide, said that here he was, a worthy student. The main one, raising his hand, asked not to say a word about what happened today. Xiangjun, saying goodbye to his friend, exclaimed that he should definitely visit the doctor, to which the latter replied that he had been pestering him for so long. The protagonist looked at his phone and was surprised. He saw progress and exclaimed that when he re-listened to the lectures, he had never seen numbers close to that. Putting his finger to his mouth, the protagonist asked if it was because he had defeated the monster, adding that it was better to see once than hear 1,000 times. Lowering his eyebrows, the boy realized that practice was the best way to improve his progress in the lectures. Scratching the back of his head, he said that in order to get at least a temporary license, he needed to enroll in the Hunter Academy, and without it he couldn't get into the dungeon, and he would have to save up for training again, but the Transcendent Academy couldn't give him a license. Xiangjun, turning his head, heard someone address him. Xiangyu raised her hand and asked if she could have a word with him, and the protagonist remembered that she was the huntress who worked for their company and the granddaughter of the Star Sword. Turning to her, the protagonist did not understand what she needed and said that he was listening to her, and she replied that she would get straight to the point. With her mouth wide open, the girl asked if he wanted to meet his grandfather. The guy looked at her indifferently and replied that he did not want to. Minchul's granddaughter, rubbing her chin, had no doubt that he wanted to which Sungjin waved his hand and left. The sunset appeared and the huntress asked him to stand, and the protagonist wanted to quickly come home and listen to lectures. Xiangmu's eyes turned white, and after introducing herself, she thought that she had never seen anything like this in her entire life and did not know what to do. The protagonist frowned and asked what this miss was offering him to join her academy, where there was not a single student, and in fact, the academy was only on paper, which made her wonder who he was. The huntress remembered how he did strange exercises and said that even if the monster was greatly weakened, it was still level 4, and he cut her in half, adding that he definitely wanted to become a hunter. Stretching her hand out to the side, Xiangyu exclaimed that they had everything he needed. Good equipment and everything else was enough, only there were no teachers, but she could, and Sungjin interrupted her that he did not need any teachers. The huntress clenched her jaw. She lowered her head and asked what if she persuaded her grandfather to take him as a student. The guy turned away and replied that he was not interested. What did the girl think? That all hunters dreamed of learning from the Star Sword? Would he really miss such an opportunity? And she would not let him go so easily. With her mouth wide open, she shouted that the exam had a written part. How was he going to pass it? And the protagonist said that he would manage somehow. Moving her legs, Xiangmu asked about the dungeons, continuing that he could go on a raid right now, but for this he had to be a student at the academy. Now he was just wasting his time. Lowering his eyebrows, the protagonist said that only government-approved academies had the right to issue licenses, and then the huntress exclaimed that they had already been approved, and if he agreed, he would be able to go to the dungeon tomorrow. Songjin began to stop. Minchul's granddaughter, widening her eyes, realized that he had slowed down and asked if he was saying that he didn't need teachers, adding that she wouldn't interfere, she would give him a place for independent training. Clenching her fingers, she continued that she wouldn't take a penny from him. Keeping his hands in his pockets, the protagonist asked if he should just enroll, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. What did she really need from him? Looking at him, the girl said that until he became a hunter, he would represent her academy in competitions, and he should also tell everyone that he was studying at her academy. The protagonist, with his mouth slightly open, realized that this was an extremely profitable offer, since he would solve all his problems at once while practically nothing was required of him, and asked why him. Xiangmu, with her eyes wide open, replied that she had seen potential in him. She looked at him with a smile. The guy, grinning, thought that this was not bad, a mutually beneficial relationship. Extending his hand to her, he introduced himself. The huntress, taking it in return, reciprocated, and thought that at some point this relationship would exhaust itself. The next day, Songjin was holding a phone. He, bringing it to his ear, heard a question about what he had done. The boss was fired. The previous day, the protagonist asked Xiangmu to tell their company that she did not like the boss and she would not cooperate with them. Closing his eyes, the guy did not think that he would be fired right away, and answered that what did he have to do with it? He probably left himself so as not to be responsible for yesterday. Women's legs appeared and it was heard that the boss himself would not have quit, but the main thing is that he is no longer there, and they asked if he was going to the Hunter Academy. The girl, raising her hand, showed that she was here. The huntress held out a temporary license. She folded her arms and said that she had been acting since yesterday, and Sungjin doubted that she would settle everything. Looking at his license, he said to himself that although he had not become a professional hunter, he had already taken the first step towards his dream, and this was only the beginning. The protagonist, holding the card, asked if she could tell him how to go on raids. Xiangmu, closing her eyes, replied that there was no need for that. She, pointing to the spears, said that she had prepared weapons for him, let him choose what he liked, and once he chose, they would go to the dungeon. She had a satisfied face and said that she had already signed the contract, thinking that he would not be against it. The entrance to the dungeon appeared. A stick flew at the rat. Sungjun, putting her behind his back, asked why she followed him, because she said that she would not interfere, and received the answer that he was the only student at the academy. She could not leave him unattended. Turning her head away, the huntress said that he had an individual task. Such an opportunity is given only to the most capable students, and the guy considered it an honor. Stepping over the monster, the girl asked if it was his first time in the dungeon, now his lifeline, although only kobolds live here. You cannot lose your vigilance, and the protagonist thought that second-level monsters are ideal for training beginners with no combat experience. Putting his weapon on his shoulder, the guy continued that he easily pierces their magic armor, as in the fight with the 4th level monster. His eyes shone and he added that attacks not imbued with mana should simply bounce off their defense. The kobold attacked the protagonist and Xiangmu told him to dodge. The monster, having missed, was confused. Sungjin swung his spear. Having hit the enemy, he thought about why his attacks were so effective. The guy, having seen the notifications, said that his progress was growing. The huntress, taking up the sword, was surprised, and the protagonist continued that it was not as fast as from killing a level 4 evil spirit, but good progress for 2 kobolds. It was definitely worth it. Besides, you can earn good money in the dungeons. Clenching his jaw, the protagonist exclaimed that it was time to speed up. He, demolishing everyone in his path, realized that the word farms experience like in a video game. Sayan turned blue, looking at him, and thought that she was scared of how unreasonable the protagonist was. In her eyes, it looked like he was staring at a turned-off phone. The girl stood right behind him and thought that this was only the beginning of the strangeness. She remembered him chopping down kobolds like a trained professional despite being a newbie who was in the dungeon for the first time. She also remembered how he was constantly doing some strange exercises with the monsters he had killed, and instead of carrying them himself, he could have called a special service. But he decided to save money. Sayan grabbed her head and thought that she couldn't hide the fact that he had a student from her grandfather forever. The moon was already shining outside, and the protagonist exclaimed that it was already midnight and he hadn't attended the lectures. Sayan closed her eyes and wondered what kind of lectures these were. The bright light was coming from the windows, and she wondered if she had made the right choice. After a while, Xiaojin smiled happily. He had 9.5 million won on his balance, and so he exclaimed that he didn't know that he could earn so much in a day. He scratched his nose and said that he, of course, carried and butchered the carcasses himself, so it was not easy. But all his efforts paid off. He opened his eyes and said that the problem was that all this took too much time and effort, because he did not even have time to listen to the lectures. The protagonist stood near the crosswalk and wondered if maybe he should ask Mr. Munchel to work together, because he trusted him, plus they could stay in touch, and if he opened his own business, then everyone would benefit. The green light came on. The protagonist walked along the crosswalk and wondered what to do with the money. He remembered how he killed the monster, and therefore thought about the fact that by clearing dungeons he both earned money and increased his progress in lectures. But everything was going slower than he expected, plus they gave nothing for the last kobold. He remembered the Great Sage and wondered if there was a quick way to become stronger. The Great Sage assumed his battle form, and the protagonist wondered how to become as strong as the Great Sky Sage Sunukun. Sajin stood up. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise. A selection window appeared on his phone, and he remembered that he had seen a part of the Great Sky Sage's lecture, but he had no money before, so he had forgotten about it, but now he could afford it. Sajin smiled happily and shouted that it was time to get down to business. But then he saw that the entry fee was 27 billion. The protagonist's mouth dropped open in surprise. He started shouting across the street because of the entry fee. Sajin sat down and began grumbling that even an S-class hunter couldn't make that much. He looked at his phone and asked if there were any other items for sale at the academy. The protagonist seemed to be on fire and started talking about how since there was no money for lectures, maybe they should at least buy some equipment. The phone said there was a transcendental shop that sold training equipment. Xiaojin opened his mouth in shock and said he couldn't believe his eyes. There were a lot of good equipment and elixirs on sale there. The protagonist grabbed his head and said that even if these were all lines, they were legendary items. He sat down and began to think that even he, who did not understand weapons, understood that this was something incredible, because the equipment was made by the students of the academy, which meant that all of this was made by transcendence. The protagonist smiled and mentally said that he could not even imagine that it was so easy to get a legendary weapon. He decided to buy the Spear of Longinus and pressed the buy button. The system calculated the cost and it turned out that it cost 100 million. The action takes place near some building. Sayan was holding documents in her hands, but suddenly raised her head and stopped. She saw the protagonist doing push-ups, and so she said that today he was training even harder. Sajin was breathing heavily, thinking about where he would get so much money for this spear, which cost 100 million. The protagonist even thought about taking out a loan and then selling the spear at a higher price, but his phone said that resale was strictly prohibited. He lowered his head and said that it was all about money again, but Soyun waved at him and asked if he had a minute. The protagonist turned around and asked her again about the academy tournament. The girl extended her hand and said that, as the name suggests, it was a competition between academies, each wanting to prove that they were better than the others. She handed him the documents and said that it was a tournament to judge the level of an academy. According to her, such competitions were very diverse since their academy was currently at level 4, but if Xiaojin did well, he would advance to the next level. Images of many participants in the tournament appeared in her mind, fighting each other. The girl raised her finger and said that the higher the level, the better the academy was considered and the more support the state would give it, so everyone sent their best students. Soyun smiled and said that he probably knew what she wanted to offer him. She pointed at him and said that she wanted him to represent their academy. Xiaojin frowned and wondered if participating in the competition would affect his progress in the lectures, since if you think about it, the tournament was also practice. He smiled and said that it sounded good, so he agreed. He turned away from her and said that they had agreed on this from the beginning. The girl put her hand to her chin and said that everything was kept a secret until the competition began, but as far as she knew, the one who got the most points from the raid and duel would win. The protagonist looked ahead and mentally said that if he thought about it, his only combat experience was with kobolds and manticores, so he had no idea how to fight against humans. The protagonist closed his eyes and wondered what he should do. Since he had already decided to participate, he needed to give it his all. He then looked at Soyun in surprise. The room was illuminated by the sunlight. The protagonist offered the girl to be his sparring partner. Soyun took the wooden sword in her hands. Xiaojin smiled, because he understood that Soyun was a B-class hunter, although B-class is far from the top of the top, but she was taught by the Star Sword himself. He saw the image of the great sword behind her. The protagonist blushed, because he thought that he, of course, was only a beginner and it was not for him to judge real hunters, but he had long wanted to know what she was capable of. Then he looked at her, because she asked if he knew that she was a B-class hunter. The young man frowned and replied that he, of course, knew about it. He got into a fighting stance, holding a spear in his hands, and asked her to give him a head start. The girl closed her eyes and said that he could attack as soon as he was ready. He immediately rushed from the spot. The protagonist ran at her with a spear and shouted that such an offer cannot be refused. Soyun calmly looked at him. In an instant, a blow occurred. The girl immediately dodged to the side. The protagonist immediately lunged towards her. He stabbed her with his spear, but Soyun easily read his attacks. She remembered how Xiaojin fought the day before. She lowered her head and thought that she had overestimated him. After all, a beginner is a beginner. A blue aura appeared around her sword and the girl mentally said that she did not know where the protagonist got the confidence that he could fight her. The girl raised her sword above her head. She slashed with the sword, intending to end the fight. However, a moment later, she widened her eyes in surprise. The protagonist blocked her attack. He held the spear in front of him and trembled, saying how difficult it was for him. Soyun's sword still had a blue aura around it, so the girl wondered how he managed to block the strike with magic. Xiaojin began to attack from the side with his spear. However, the girl managed to block the attack, but she couldn't get the thought out of her head that his weapon should have jumped out of his hands and her sword would have been right at his throat. The protagonist slid back after the girl blocked his attack. She stood calmly and looked at him. The protagonist smiled. Blood appeared on his lip and he said that then he would also fight seriously. She stood and fought off his attacks, realizing that his movements had changed and his attacks became clearer and faster. A blue aura emanated from his blows. The protagonist's eyes glowed blue. He continued to attack Seiyan, remembering someone's words about first making obvious attacks and then diluting them with feints, in other words, distracting blows. The protagonist made several more attacks with the spear, but the girl blocked them too. Seiyan put her sword in front of her and blocked another attack. The protagonist spun the spear and made another attack. Seiyan kept her sword down, so the protagonist realized that she was now open to his real attack. He immediately closed the distance and was above her. The protagonist swung his spear. Xiaojin was reflected in her eyes, and she knew that she was in danger. An explosion occurred and a blue aura enveloped the room. Seiyan stood up and wondered what just happened. Xiaojin was lying against the wall, coughing up blood. She immediately ran towards him, realizing that she had just struck with all her might without even thinking. The protagonist scratched the back of his head and said that he was fine, but in the end, he lost. She opened her mouth wide in surprise and wondered if he really thought he could win, even though he knew he was fighting a B-class hunter. The protagonist looked at her and mentally said that fighting a hunter like a monster would not work. Suddenly he looked at his pocket because he had received a notification, but a moment before that he was thinking about how much he still had ahead of him. He opened his phone and saw that his progress had increased. He began to turn his head towards her and asked if she was free before the tournament, to which the girl replied that she was free. Then he asked if they could practice some more when there were no raids. The protagonist smiled and said that it would be useful for him, but Seyun was only thinking about how much he had been beaten and he wanted to continue fighting with her. The girl smiled and said that she would do whatever he asked, and if he won the tournament, she would give him all the prize money. The protagonist suddenly turned pale and wondered if they really gave money there. Seyun put her hand to her chin and began to think out loud about how much prize money there was, and then suddenly said that the prize money was 100 million South Korean won. The protagonist immediately remembered the spear he wanted to buy. Suddenly, it seemed like fire began to emanate from him and he asked when the tournament would take place. His eyes lit up when he learned that the tournament would take place in 2 weeks. The girl grabbed her head because the protagonist immediately began to think out loud about how to train most effectively. Sajin picked up a stone block and began to lunge with it. The girl closed her eyes, accepting that she did not understand anything. The sky was clear. 2 weeks had passed. Many people were walking around the building. The guy in the green shirt said that he finally got to the tournament venue. He looked to the side and noticed that there was quite a large crowd. Everyone around looked at him with horror because he said out loud that although there were many more awakened, it was not often possible to see hunters fight. And where would we be without recruiters from guilds and mercenaries, and there were probably some from the government too. He walked up to the man with the red ribbon and he showed him the way. He walked into the waiting room for the participants. The boy was very nervous and wondered what to do. He walked into the room filled with participants and began to think that he was so nervous because he came alone, and he was so scared that he couldn't move. He looked at the one with the scar and admired his equipment. Then he looked at the smiling blonde and thought that they were probably all confident. Suddenly, he noticed Seojun sitting on the bench. The protagonist was holding an old spear and a spear bag made from clothes. The boy adjusted his glasses and looked at the protagonist. The protagonist was looking at his phone while the people around him were looking at him and saying that he was probably forced to participate. The guy in the green shirt put his hands to his chest, realizing something. The boy put his hand to his mouth and thought that they were similar because in his opinion, the protagonist was acting as if he came to a new class where he didn't know anyone, and was trying to pretend to be busy by staring at his phone, just like Seojun. In his eyes, the protagonist looked very insecure and withdrawn. The guy in the green shirt stood in front of the protagonist and cried. Seojun looked up because the guy greeted him. The guy scratched the back of his head and said that his name was Mingi and that he was also participating in the tournament. Suddenly, a participant shouted from behind them. Mingi pointed at him and said that it was Dak Chul, a promising student of Gachuri Academy who fights with an axe and relies on strength in everything. Dak Chul had his back to them and was arguing with another contestant. The boy with the scar on his eye, Chial Min, frowned and said rudely to him. Mingi adjusted his glasses and said that everyone said that Chial Min was very unusual because he fought with dual daggers. A man appeared behind them and asked if they could be quieter. A red-haired boy was looking at them. The red-haired boy, Ju Hwan, frowned and said that they were not alone in this tournament. Mingi lowered his head and said that this boy's name was Ju Hwan and that he was a gifted student of Revenant Academy and, in fact, the winner of this tournament. Seojun turned around and asked him about it, and Mingi replied that Juwon usually doesn't participate in the tournament, saying that he has no reason to fight such weaklings. But apparently something happened at the academy and they decided to send him, and since he's here, the winner is obvious. They looked at the ceiling and Mingi started talking about the Star Sword. Seojun's mouth dropped open in shock when Mingi said that according to rumors, the Star Sword's granddaughter invited Juwon to her academy. They looked at his back and Mingi said that he didn't know the reason, but Juwon refused, so he must be very confident in himself to reject the offer of the Star Sword's granddaughter himself. The trash can fell from the impact and Juwon wondered out loud why he had to compete with such worthless people. The young man stood with his hands in his pockets and thought that if it weren't for his uncle's wishes, they would have moved on to the third level a long time ago, and besides, winning such a tournament wouldn't bring him recognition. Juwon grinned and thought that if he knew that things would turn out like this, he would have agreed to Seon's offer. He remembered how Seon invited him to the academy, and so the young man thought about how he refused because he didn't want to study at some unknown academy. But he could just use her and then get rid of her, since she was the granddaughter of the Star Sword after all. Suddenly, he looked to the side. Seojun frowned and looked at him. The protagonist silently looked at him and wondered how much he would get for fighting him. The young men were still looking at each other attentively, but suddenly the organizers announced the start of the tournament. Mingi began to turn his head and said that the tournament seemed to be starting. The protagonist stood at the entrance to the arena and thought about how he had been trying to reach 30% for the past 2 weeks based on Chiron and the Hegemon King's lectures, although he hadn't noticed any significant changes in strength or anything else, since the difference between 19 and 20% was much greater than between 20 and 21%. He remembered his recent fights and thought that he lacked experience compared to others. The protagonist looked at his hand and mentally said that he had been trying to compensate for the gap by training with Seiyan and fighting in the dungeon. He clenched his fist and exclaimed that it didn't matter who was in front of him, a human or a monster. The protagonist put his fist to his chest. He was standing in some closed rectangular room, and then the host immediately exclaimed that a race in the labyrinth was about to begin. The spectators were looking at the huge screen in the center. The man with the camera waved to another and called out to him. The man in the shirt suddenly bumped into the girl. He bowed and apologized. Then the man sat down next to his friend and said that the girl reminded him of someone. Several participants were shown on the screen, and the man was talking about how the only thing they were told about this challenge was that they had to get out of the labyrinth, and that they were not allowed to attack other participants. Dak Chul was fighting against a monster in the form of a bull. Coleman had already defeated his monster and was reading a hint leading to the exit. The man put his hand to his chin and said that this year's students were strong. Meanwhile, Ju Hwan cut the monster with his red sword. A red aura surrounded him. Everyone smiled and said that this student was clearly on a different level. Si-yoon looked at the screen and was surprised that it was Ju Hwan. The girl put her hand to her chest and wondered what he was doing here. She turned away from the man who almost recognized her because she can't let anyone know that she is the granddaughter of the Star Sword because she wants to watch the tournament in peace. The action moves to the protagonist's labyrinth. He held the spear above himself. The protagonist put the weapon in front of him and said that, as he thought, the wall cannot be broken. He put one hand on his side and said that he will have to get out like everyone else. The young man put his hand to the wall. He walked along the wall and said that if he uses the power that lifts mountains twice, he will be able to break the wall. Suddenly, he looked into the distance. In front of him was a fork in the road with several paths. The hero approached one of the exits, guided by the fact that he just needs to stick to one side, because then he will eventually find the exit. Suddenly, his eyes began to glow slightly. He turned around and wondered what this indescribable feeling was. He looked at the other paths. He turned around and was enveloped by an aura, and suddenly he began to think that instead of keeping to the left, it would be better to go in the direction he was looking. A drop of sweat rolled down his face. The protagonist still decided to go forward. He put his hand on the back of his head and thought that he should trust his intuition. After a while, he frowned, thinking that this was strange. The protagonist was looking forward and suddenly the announcer announced that student Suckman had dropped out of the tournament, so the protagonist thought that apparently the others were constantly fighting monsters. The protagonist continued walking and wondered why everything was quiet for him then. Suddenly, his eyes widened in surprise, because he realized that his intuition was telling him how to get around the monsters. Mingyi appeared behind him. The protagonist was very unhappy because Mingyi began to shout that he needed to be careful because a monster could be waiting around every corner. A memory of how he had just met this weirdo appeared in his head. Mingyi was shaking his head from side to side and saying that Xiaojun was walking so confidently as if he knew the way, but the protagonist replied that he was just going wherever he wanted. Mingyi trembled and exclaimed that he shouldn't go wherever he wanted because it could end badly, and besides, he knew how to get out of the labyrinth, so he wanted to lead the protagonist. He put his hand on the wall and said that if you always stick to one side, you can easily find the exit. But the protagonist replied that it would take too long, and therefore it would be better to trust your feelings. Then Mingyi extended his hand and exclaimed that Xiaojun would get lost like that, but the protagonist suggested that they split up. Mingyi adjusted his glasses and replied that he followed him because Xiaojun was his fellow sufferer. Mingyi scratched the back of his head and said that he didn't come from the academy, and looking at the protagonist, he decided that he was alone too. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise, as Mingyi had said that weaklings should stick together. Xiaojun clutched his head and thought that he probably looked like that from the outside, and Mingyi put his hand in his pocket and said that since Xiaojun was also alone, he would make an exception for him and show him something incredible. The young man showed the protagonist a photo of his sister and exclaimed that she was very cute. The protagonist turned away from him and began to walk away, whispering that he hoped that they would never meet again, but Mingyi held his leg and asked him not to leave. The protagonist smiled awkwardly and began to think that even awakened people can be scared in such a place, and even Xiaojun would have been scared if he were younger. Mingyi held a katana in his hands and talked about the dangers of traveling alone. The protagonist turned around and noticed that Mingyi kept saying that he was alone, so he asked if his parents and sister had come to support him. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise when the boy answered that his parents were dead and that he had no one except his little sister. Suddenly, an old memory from his childhood popped into the protagonist's head. In the memory, he was sitting on the floor, leaning against the bed. Xiaojun simply remained silent. Mingyi started to shake his head, saying that it was a long time ago and he just wanted to say that his sister was still little and couldn't come to support him. Mingyi opened his mouth in surprise when the protagonist said that they really were going to get together in misfortune. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that they could go together if Mingyi wanted. Xiaojun turned around and decided to immediately warn that they weren't a team and that the first place prize would go to the protagonist. Mingyi stood still while Xiaojun started to walk away from him. He had already turned the corner. Mingyi immediately ran after him and started shouting. The protagonist smiled and said that Mingyi himself said that he would follow him. The young man looked at him and thought about how Xiaojun didn't hesitate at all and was too confident in himself because he chose the path without even thinking. The protagonist suddenly looked away because something caught his eye. Mingyi opened his mouth wide and started shouting that they were at a dead end. However, Xiaojun put his hand on the wall and said that there seemed to be an exit here. He pushed the door with his hand and it opened. Mingyi's eyes widened in surprise. The screen showed that the protagonist had set a new record for clearing the game, which was 27 minutes and 12 seconds. The protagonist and Mingyi were standing in the aisle. The audience in the stands had their jaws dropped because it wasn't Juwon. Seiyun's jaws dropped too. Mingyi was screaming with his mouth wide open. The big screen showed Xiaojun. He was scratching his ear, saying that it was a waste of time since he hadn't met any monsters. Mingi was sweating profusely from excitement and wondering how things had turned out like this. Xiaojun was first on the winners list, followed by Mingi. The two of them were sitting on the same bench, and the other participants were standing around them, discussing them. Juwon approached the protagonist, but the protagonist was looking at his phone and did not notice it at first. Then he raised his head and saw Juwon's displeased face. The participants around them looked at them and suddenly there was silence. The protagonist looked at him and wondered what Juwon wanted and why he was looking at him like that. Juwon frowned and stared at the protagonist. Then the young man turned away and said that the protagonist was just lucky. The other participants seemed to turn into a shadow because they were extremely quiet. A moment later, a man entered the room and asked for a minute of attention. He was holding a document in his hands and said that he was about to announce that in the second stage they would have to fight each other one-on-one. All the participants looked at him attentively, and he continued to tell them that since they were all on the 4th level, in order to be on equal terms, it was forbidden to strengthen weapons with Ma. However, they could still strengthen their bodies with it, but they should also take into account that if one of the participants was unable to fight, the referee would stop the match. Xiaojun looked ahead and thought about the fact that 32 students had advanced to the second round, and in that case, 5 rounds should be held. One participant suddenly raised his hand and said that he wanted to withdraw from the tournament. The protagonist's mouth opened wide in surprise and could not understand what was happening. Meanwhile, Xiaojun was walking somewhere. She turned her head and said that she was almost discovered. She remembered how the man pointed his finger at her, so the girl closed her eyes and said that she never thought that Xiaojun would win. The girl turned around and thought that she would come back when everything calmed down, but suddenly she heard someone's dissatisfied shouts. She stood around the corner and watched as the men complained about the tournament starting with the semi-finals right away since the others refused to participate. The man frowned and said that they had ruined all the fun, and another man said that there was no point in betting now. The bald man behind the counter said that it was obvious that Juwon would win, so no one in their right mind would bet on another participant. Suddenly, an unknown man put a suitcase with money on the table and said that he was betting 100 million on the protagonist to win. He was standing there in a black cape and hood. Seun looked at him and wondered who he was. A purple aura was emanating from this man. Meanwhile, Xiaojun looked ahead sadly. A few minutes ago, one participant raised his hand and announced that he was withdrawing from the tournament. Mingi adjusted his glasses and whispered that he heard that this was not uncommon in level 4 tournaments, since the same people always win. The other participants looked at Juwon in horror and said that they did not want to fight against him, because then they could end up crippled. Then they looked at the other 2 participants in the tournament and said that if they continued, they would just serve as a springboard for their already famous academies. Sweat was pouring down their faces because they were very nervous, but they decided that it was better to just give up. The participants began to run en masse and declare that they were withdrawing from the tournament. Mingi was turning his head from side to side, and Xiaojun just stood and watched all this silently. There were only 5 participants left in the room, including Mingi and the protagonist. Xiaojun would participate in the first match, and his opponent would be Dak Chol. Juwon and Mingi would participate in the second match, but the protagonist knew that Cholman would still fight against the red-haired student. The protagonist suddenly noticed that Mingi's hands were shaking badly. Mingi started crying and screaming that they were going to a duel soon, and that he didn't understand why the protagonist wasn't scared. The young man started shaking the protagonist, screaming that he still had to fight Juwon. Xiaojun smiled and said that the fight hadn't even started and he had already written himself down as a loser, but Mingi replied that it was all because he knew that it would be like that. Mingi smiled awkwardly when the protagonist suggested that he withdraw from the tournament. Mingi lowered his head and replied that he couldn't, and at that moment the tournament organizer entered the room and called them to a fight. Xiaojun stood up and said that since he had decided to fight, he should fight until the very end, because maybe he would be able to win. Mingi suddenly grabbed his hand. The young man stood up and silently looked at the protagonist. A drop of sweat was sliding down his cheek, and he asked if Xiaojun wasn't worried. The protagonist smiled and replied that he only cared about how much experience he would get for the fight. He turned around and said that 100 million were waiting for him. The protagonist stood in the center of the large arena while the commentator talked about how now that all the punks had been eliminated, only the strongest remained. Xiaojun raised his hand and greeted everyone, thinking that the commentator had done a good job of explaining that everyone had simply dropped out of fear. The protagonist looked away. Dak Chol was smiling and saying that he felt sorry for the protagonist, since he had won the first round and had immediately run into him. Dak Chol turned away and started shouting that luck had apparently turned against the protagonist. An evil grin immediately appeared on the student's face when Xiaojun replied that it was too early to judge who was unlucky. Dak Chol ran at him, shouting that he would make him regret his words. Xiaojun smiled calmly. Mingi sat with his head down. He raised his head when he heard the fight start. Juwon was standing in front of him in the room. The red-haired boy was frowning and looking ahead, and Mingi, looking at him, was thinking that he would soon come face to face with him. Mingi was shaking and recalling the words of the main character that if he decided to fight, then he should fight until the very end. He clenched his fist and began to think that both Dak Chul and Juwon represented famous academies, and therefore people like him and Sajin were not their equals, and therefore Mingi decided that it was worth giving up before it was too late. But suddenly everyone's mouths opened wide in shock. Mingi's jaw dropped when the commentator exclaimed that the fight was over in the blink of an eye. Sajin was standing over his opponent lying on the ground. Juwon looked away and said that the scum belong among the scum. Suddenly, he turned his gaze to Mingi. The boy stood up from the bench. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek as he was very nervous. Juwon grinned viciously. A moment later, we see Dak Chul swing his axe. However, Seojin dodged the blow, and the commentator noted the crushing power of the student with the axe. Seojin watched the fight closely, and the commentator noted that the protagonist easily dodged the enemy's attacks. Dak Chul opened his eyes wide and wondered what was wrong with the protagonist. Seojin continued to easily dodge the many attacks that Dak Chul dealt without stopping, so much so that he himself was already exhausted. Dak Chul grinned and wondered why his attacks did not work on the protagonist. A red aura appeared around him, and already standing close to the protagonist, he asked if he could dodge now. However, Seojin blocked his axe with his spear. The axe landed on the ground behind the student. Dak Chul fell to the ground. The young man trembled and wondered if he had lost. And here we see the scene again where Seojin stands over his defeated opponent. After a while, he was looking at his phone. He was leaving the arena and saying that he thought he would get more for fighting other students. He frowned deeply and wondered what he should do, because not only would he not have time to complete the Buddha course, but also Chiron and even the Hegemon King, since his free pass would expire in 52 days. He entered the waiting room, thinking about tightening his belt to save up for a spear and extend his pass, and therefore he simply had to win. Mingi immediately stood in front of the protagonist and began to say that he saw his fight and realized how strong Seojin was. The organizer entered the room and warned the participants of the second duel to get ready. Mingi suddenly trembled. Juwon stood with his head down. He touched Mingi with his shoulder and, calling him names, ordered him to get out of the way. Seojin silently watched the red-haired student leave, and Mingi asked if the protagonist remembered Mingi telling him in the labyrinth that they needed to stick together. The boy lowered his head and said that he didn't know why, but when he saw the protagonist, he felt a kindred spirit, and so when the protagonist defeated Dak Chul, Mingi was happy as if he had won, but at the same time he envied the protagonist. The protagonist silently watched him, and the boy continued to talk about how he was never lucky and had no talent, and was also not as strong as the protagonist. Mingi clenched his fist and exclaimed that he only wanted his little sister to be proud of him. Mingi ran to the duel, and Seojin told him to give it his all. Seojin smiled as he watched. The screen showed two opponents. Mingi stood with his back to Juwon. He put his hand to his chest and began to convince himself that he would succeed. Juwon frowned and ordered him to stop mumbling, as it was annoying. The judge stood in front of them and began to remind them of the rules, but Juwon at that moment was only thinking about how humiliating it was to participate in such a tournament. Mingi stood with his head down. Juwon frowned, and his eyes glowed blue. Mingi seemed to be in the dark. The young man looked away, and the red-haired man looked at him attentively. He imagined him as prey in the form of a roe deer. He saw how Mingi, in the form of prey, looked at him with fear. Juwon imagined that he was a predator like a tiger, and therefore his opponent was just prey. The young man frowned and mentally said that he was just lucky, and therefore he needed to remind the worm where his place was. They stood opposite each other, and the red-haired one thought that he should have won both stages because he was head and shoulders above all these worms. Mingi looked at him with a frown. He held his sword in front of him, although he was shaking. Juwon got angry when he saw this and wondered if this worm really thought he could win. The red-haired one turned to the judge and asked when they would start, and the judge replied that they would be announced soon. Mingi looked ahead and thought that he would do just like Seojin. Juwon looked ahead and thought that there was no point in this tournament in the first place. He immediately attacked Mingi, exclaiming that he would finish everything with one blow. Mingi managed to block the attack. The red-haired one struck again, but Mingi, surprisingly, was able to block the attack. Juwon looked at him and called him a pathetic worm. He immediately hit him in the stomach with the handle of the sword and shouted that he shouldn't have come here in the first place. Blood spurted out of Mingi's mouth. Mingi was kneeling and writhing in pain. Juwon was walking towards him while the boy was thinking that he couldn't win. Mingi was holding his stomach and mentally saying that he didn't care about winning because he understood the difference between their strengths. As Juwon slowly approached, Mingi was thinking that he wanted his sister to be proud of him, and he also wanted to become as strong as Seojin. Suddenly, tears appeared in his eyes and he mentally exclaimed the protagonist's name. Mingi immediately stood up from his knees. He held the sword in front of him and decided to hit Juwon at least once. The boy immediately made a dash. He began to swing the sword, thinking that he just wanted to touch him with at least the tip of the sword. The blade of the sword was already at the face of the red-haired student, but he was not at all worried. Dust rose in the arena and the fighters were not visible. However, a moment later, Mingi was lying on the ground, which meant that he had lost. People from the stands looked at the fighters and said that there was nothing surprising in such an outcome of the fight, since Mingi was not fit to hold a candle to such an elite student as Juwon. Suddenly, a small cut appeared on his cheek and blood began to flow from it. The elite student looked at his cheek. On the big screen, his face was shown in close-up. Juwon was looking at Mingi, who was lying unconscious. His eyes glowed blue. He turned around and wondered if this worm had really injured him, an elite student. The judge was sitting next to Mingi and suddenly Juwon told him that he was withdrawing from the tournament. The elite student immediately kicked Mingi in the head. He opened his mouth wide and began to scream that he was fed up with this circus. The judge yelled at the boy that if he didn't stop, they would have to take action, but Juwon replied that he had already withdrawn from the tournament. The red-haired student put his foot on Mingi's head. Looking down at him, the boy said that these pathetic worms were crawling around, forgetting their place. Suddenly, Xiaojun attacked him, but Juwon blocked the attack. The protagonist approached him and said that he had been waiting for them to meet in the finals, but he was tired of it. Frowning, the protagonist said that he would beat him up right now since Juwon insisted so much. Mingi was lying between them. The protagonist looked at him and ordered him to remove his foot. Juwon looked down and asked if he was talking about the foot he had put on Mingi's head. Xiaojun frowned in anger. He swung his spear and the red-haired student had to jump back. Xiaojun immediately picked up Mingi. He held his head. Juwon watched from the side, but suddenly the protagonist asked him if he really liked looking down on people. The protagonist leaned forward a little and asked what was wrong with Juwon, because who in their right mind would put their foot on someone else? They were standing close to each other in a large arena, and the elite student replied that he felt sick that some country bumpkin forgot his place. The protagonist raised his head and asked if they really couldn't dream of anything since they were worse than him, but Juwon laughed and said that he didn't know that in their time, anyone believed in such fairy tales. The people in the stands were quite quiet and wondered why the judges didn't intervene, and Juwon wondered out loud if Xiaojun also believed that if he trained hard, he would succeed. The judges were talking to each other about how this was an order from above and they could only watch, while the hooded man stood nearby and smiled. A drop of sweat rolled down Si-Yun's cheek because she was worried about her student. Juwon extended his hand and said that the world was arranged in such a way that if a person had no talent, then he was nothing, and in order to achieve success, you need to step over others, so, according to him, there was no place for dreams here, and in the world there were only worthy people and losers. Xiaojun's eyes widened in shock. He held Mingi in his arms and mentally said that in fact, he himself used to think the same way. The protagonist began to remember that all those 9 painfully long years when he endured everything just to become a hunter. He worked at a construction site and was constantly faced with harsh reality. The protagonist hated himself for his helplessness and the fact that he had no money or talent, and his job was just keeping him afloat, but he could not achieve more. And so the protagonist thought that perhaps there was nothing more pathetic than clinging to something that cannot be achieved with hard work. And he remembered how many times he asked himself how his life would have turned out if he had given up, if he had chosen a different path. He turned to the judge standing behind him and asked him to take care of Mingi. He passed by the judge, thinking that he was constantly giving into fear, doubting himself, and he understood that this is how many people fall into despair. The protagonist stood in front of the elite student. He looked at him with wild eyes and asked him what he would say to this. Xiaojun rushed to attack, and the judge began to shout that this was against the rules and asked him to stop. He spun his spear. Juwon closed his eyes and sighed. He smiled and exclaimed that Xiaojun must be joking. The student immediately blocked the attack. They got closer and Juwon called the protagonist a pathetic bug, but the protagonist replied that Juwon was a bug. The protagonist jumped back. The elite student lunged and swung his sword. Xiaojun retreated, fending off the enemy's attacks. The protagonist frowned and thought that it was no wonder everyone thought highly of Juwon. The elite student's eyes glowed blue as he continued to attack, while the protagonist began to think that in the fight with the previous opponent, he was sure that he would win, but now everything was different. However, he immediately closed his eyes to stop these thoughts and decided to trust his feelings. A moment later, he struck his opponent in the stomach. Juwon's eyes widened in surprise. He swung his sword and threw the protagonist back. The elite student held his sword in front of him and began to shout for the judges not to interfere with him because he was a predator, the top of the food chain. He noticed the protagonist's gaze. Xiaojun's eyes glowed blue. The protagonist was in a fighting stance and a blue aura was emanating from him. Jiwon smiled and wondered why a worm had the gaze of a predator. In an instant, the elite student closed the distance and said that there was no harm in dreaming, but he wanted to see what would happen to his dreams when he faced reality. The student hit the protagonist hard from above. Seojin blocked the attack with his spear. Then the protagonist blocked the attack again. Then Seojin hit back. He extended his spear in front of him, preparing to attack. Jiwon raised his head in surprise and thought about how it seemed like Seojin was getting stronger with each block, like a monster growing right before his eyes. Jiwon received a hit. However, Seojin was also attacked. They flew back apart. The elite student lowered his head and wondered if he was pushed away by some kind of worm. A red aura enveloped him and he said that it would not happen again. Seojin's eyes widened as he saw the aura, and he also thought about how he couldn't control mana yet, so he had nothing to fight back against the elite student. Jiwon swung his sword, which was covered in aura, and shouted that he would kill the protagonist, but the protagonist was thinking that running was the best option. But he didn't want to run because he felt that he would lose everything he had learned if he ran away. He seemed to be in pitch darkness, and he began to hear the voice of the Hegemon King, who was saying that he was surrounded by an enemy army, and he could hear their screams from all sides. The Hegemon King seemed to be behind the protagonist. He crossed his arms and said that he had rushed towards the enemy back then, even though the outcome of the battle had already been decided. Jiwon started running towards the protagonist, and the Hegemon King continued to tell him that he had lost and that it could not be changed. He was afraid, and defeat scared him the most. The protagonist gripped his spear tighter, and the Hegemon King said that he had rushed into battle anyway because it was simply necessary. The image of the Hegemon King appeared behind the protagonist, who exclaimed that the power that rips mountains out of the ground will erase any barriers, and the spirit that can turn the whole world upside down will rule over him. The protagonist also rushed to attack. Jiwon clenched his jaw tightly. Then the elite student opened his mouth wide and began to scream that he was a predator here, and they were his mat on which to wipe his feet. They were already in front of each other, and the judges were running towards them to try to stop them. Jiwon opened his mouth and screamed for Seojin to die. The protagonist swung his sword and began to scream. They struck each other and their auras collided. The entire arena was illuminated by a bright light. The guards were lying on the ground. The surrounding area was covered in dust, but the silhouettes of two youths who were still standing could be seen. The protagonist's head dropped and he began to fall to the ground. He leaned on his spear, but Jiwon fell to the ground. The protagonist's hand was shaking, but he was conscious. Jiwon was lying on the ground unconscious, and blood was flowing from his mouth. The dust around him cleared. The protagonist lowered his head and looked at the elite student lying at his feet. Everyone around him raised their hands and cheered. Behind the protagonist, Soyun was seen, stunned. A drop of sweat rolled down her cheek while she mentally said that 2 weeks ago, he barely blocked a blow soaked in mana and now he uses aura. However, then she just smiled. Suddenly, she noticed a mysterious man in a hoodie behind her. She looked closely at his face, but she did not notice any distinguishing features, but she knew that it was him she had seen at the bookmaker's office. Suddenly, he took off his hood and exclaimed that this was impossible. Si-yoon turned away from him and, looking forward, thought that she was also surprised, but not that surprised. She suddenly opened her eyes wide in surprise, because she remembered that he had bet on the protagonist to win. The girl turned around, but the mysterious guy had already disappeared. She looked up in surprise. The protagonist was walking along a crosswalk. He had a couple of bandages on his face and he looked very disappointed. He remembered how a man in a suit told him that he was disqualified. The protagonist smiled awkwardly while the man told him that they acknowledged that Jiwon had behaved inappropriately, but he had already withdrawn from the tournament and Seojin had intervened, being a participant. The man closed his eyes and said that the protagonist had violated the tournament rules with his actions, and Seojin only agreed with this and asked what happened to Jiwon. There were several doctors standing around the elite hero, and the man said that Jiwon was, of course, also disqualified, and that strengthening the sword with aura was considered attempted murder. The elite student was lying unconscious on a stretcher, and the man said that Jiwon would not go to court, but the Hunter Association would forbid him from taking the exam for the next 5 years. The protagonist walked down the street, looking at his phone, and thought about the fact that Cheolman had automatically become the winner, Mingi took second place, and Dakshil took third, but this did not upset the protagonist at all, because after the fight with the elite student, his experience had increased greatly. The protagonist remembered the strange power he felt in the battle and realized that this power could have appeared just because the progress in the Hegemon King's lecture had exceeded 50%. Suddenly, someone put a hand on his shoulder while he was thinking about whether to sign up for another course. Seon was behind him. The protagonist began waving his hands, saying that as she saw it, everything was fine, because he may look weak, but in fact he was a tough nut. Seon closed her eyes and smiled, because she was happy for him. The girl looked at the protagonist in surprise because he asked her for forgiveness. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that he would have won if he had not interfered where he was not wanted, but San replied that he had nothing to apologize for. He happily opened his mouth and asked the girl again why she was asking him if he was okay. Suddenly, everything around him changed when he heard her words about how he had been counting on the prize money. The protagonist grabbed his head and started screaming. He held his head and remembered the Spear of Longinus, while Soyun asked him what he wanted to spend the money on. Seojin sat down and said that he had his eye on one spear and really wanted to buy it. The protagonist stood up and said that it was okay. However, Seojin hung his head and said that he would be lying if he said he didn't regret anything, but if he hadn't intervened, he would have regretted it even more. Soyun looked at him carefully. Suddenly, Mingi started running towards them. He waved his hand at them. The young man, trying to catch his breath, asked if Seojin was already leaving. Then Mingi grabbed the back of his head and started mumbling something. He silently looked down. Having made up his mind, he raised his head and asked if he could become as strong as Seojin if he trained hard. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise. Mingi trembled as he looked at him. Seojin's mouth dropped open. Then he suddenly answered seriously that it would not be easy, but at the same time, the protagonist was thinking that Mingi clearly lacked the talent to become a hunter. But of course, they say that anything can be achieved if you work hard, but the world is cruel, and therefore dreams and ideals alone will not get you far. The protagonist looked at him and said that he should not focus on becoming a hunter because he can do other things, and Mingi is young and has plenty of time, so he should not be upset. Mingi smiled and said that Seojin was right in some way. The sunlight reflected on the windows of the building, and Mingi happily said that he did not want to spoil anyone's mood, but just came to say goodbye. He turned around and left, but not before thanking the protagonist for everything. Behind him, the protagonist exclaimed that Mingi should not let anyone tell him what to do, be it him or anyone else. Mingi stopped, and Seojin continued to talk about how they would try to convince Mingi that he had no talent and that he could do nothing about it, and they would also tell him that he couldn't handle it, that only failure awaited him. The protagonist frowned and told Mingi not to forget that no one's opinion should become his reality. Mingi was already crying, and Seojin kept saying that if he wanted something, he should go ahead and do it, and the rest didn't matter. They waved at each other, and Mingi exclaimed that he would visit the protagonist with his little sister someday. The protagonist grabbed his head and said that he was always sticking his nose into other people's business. Seojin smiled and said that she didn't see anything wrong with it, and besides, the protagonist got his first fan, but Seojin said that another student would be better than just a fan. She widened her eyes in surprise when the boy said that they should have taken advantage of the moment and invited Mingi to their academy. The protagonist began to distance himself from her. He grabbed the back of his head. The girl smiled and repeated his words about their academy. The girl ran up to him and said that he worked hard so she would buy him a new spear, and besides, it was his scholarship. The action moves to a house. A man was walking barefoot through the house. A man in a suit who was missing a hand asked about a certain master. The master was sitting in the room, and the two men were standing near the door. The door suddenly opened. A man named Munchel, who was also the right hand of the Star Sword, knelt down and greeted the master. The gray-haired old man said that he had made it clear when he asked not to disturb him. A terrifying aura emanated from him, and he himself asked if Munchel dared to ignore his orders. The man closed one eye and, barely breathing, said that Miss San participated in the academy tournament. The Star Sword turned slightly. He stopped pressing on them with his monstrous aura. San showed the protagonist the spear. However, the young man closed his eyes and said that this spear was no good for him. Star Sword stood up because Munchel started talking about how Soyun apparently had a student. Star Sword, Munchel put his hand to his chin and said that he personally had to see what this student was like. The academy building was visible. A voice was coming from it, counting something. Someone was waving something like a spear, continuing to count. It was Seojin. He had already made his 5,000th strike. Wiping his forehead, he said that the daily task was completed. Soyun was standing behind the guy. Turning around to look at her, the hero asked why she was looking at him with such displeasure, to which she replied that he imagined it. Remembering the situation when the protagonist wanted to buy a new spear, the girl said that he had chosen it so meticulously, but in the end left with nothing, to which he replied that he was simply not worthy of such a gift. Pointing her finger at the young man, the girl said that he was not the type to refuse such a gift. The guy, imagining the spear, understood that since he saw a weapon created by transcendentals, he could not even look at a regular one. Tears appeared in the hero's eyes. He knew that it was all because of the calculations, remembering when he tried to ask for a huge amount of money in cash, the price simply increased. He stood behind the money, arguing that apparently money earned dishonestly will not be counted, while the girl said that she was going to pay for everything and such a chance comes once in a lifetime. She turned to Seojin. He looked at her when she asked the question about what kind of mana amplification technique the hero had, to which he replied that he did not know about such a concept. The young man looked at her when she explained to him that without such a technique, he would not even be able to use magic, adding that she personally saw how the hero pierced the armor of monsters, and judging by how he fought in the tournament, his technique was clearly not low class. The protagonist's eyes widened as she continued to say that she had never seen him train her, and he understood that he did not know any such mana enhancement technique. The guy imagined the human body. He knew that the mana enhancement technique was a technique that allowed him to use mana most effectively. Having imagined the various ways to use it, he also remembered that it was divided into high-class and low-class techniques and that each hunter had his own, because some even patented it. Looking at the girl, he thought that this was why he wanted to get into an elite academy. He also asked her if she taught the Star Sword mana enhancement technique. Putting his hands on his hips, he answered that her grandfather forbade her. The guy understood why, because otherwise there would be crowds of students here. The training room was visible. Seiyan offered the guy to teach him her technique. He exclaimed that she really created her technique. She answered affirmatively, adding that she always wanted to teach. The girl beamed, not understanding why he was asking. He said that he was just curious. He realized that he was wrong, because he thought that she had no talent at all, or that she lived in the shadow of the Star Sword. The guy looked at her, understanding that a hunter without mana is nowhere, because even in the fight with Juin he felt the difference in strength between someone who knows how to use the technique and someone who does not. Rubbing his chin, the hero suggested that since there was a window for a new lecture, why not take some course on mana? The girl did not understand why he was silent, not understanding that she really asked something difficult. She turned around and left, wishing him good luck, but thought to herself that nothing could be done, so let him remain silent. Looking at her, the young man asked where she was going. The girl answered that she was leaving on business. Holding the spear in his hands, the guy said that he didn't know she was so businesslike. She told him to close the doors if he left before she returned. Waving his hand at her, he asked her not to worry. Still holding his hand, he thought about which course he should choose. The girl went outside, and the protagonist continued to think about where the mentor could have disappeared to when he needed him so much. There was a course from the Archmage Merlin on the phone, who talked about mana, saying that in a world that obeys the laws of cause and effect, mana is capable of destroying these laws of the universe. The guy's eyes turned white. He looked at the Archmage, who said that it was as simple as it could be. But the hero understood that he would also start to go crazy from such lectures, almost like with Buddha. Continuing to look at the screen, he heard Merlin's words. He said that enough explanations and it was time for practice. A daily task for creating mana spheres appeared in front of the young man. He folded his arms and said that he should at least try. His body was covered in a blue glow. Sweat appeared on his face. He understood that feeling and controlling mana was not so difficult, most likely thanks to Chiron's lectures, but it would still be difficult. Although he felt mana, he could not give it a form. The guy closed his eyes, remembering the words of the Archmage, who told him that with the help of mana you need to connect the mind with the outside world, transferring the fruit of your imagination into reality, deceiving it and convincing it that everything happens according to the laws of nature. The hero opened his eyes wide. A small lump of mana appeared in the guy's hands, because as the magician said, this is the most striking example of a force that does not exist anywhere in nature. He looked at it in surprise. A sphere of mana appeared in his hands. He raised it to his face. Continuing to look at it, he said out loud that it most likely will not be counted. The guy frowned, realizing that he would get better and better with time. Someone appeared behind the guy and called out to the hero. He turned to him. In front of him was a star sword. He was thinking that he came here only to see who entered the Saiyan Academy. The man looked at the protagonist, surprised that he had a cloud of mana in his hands, because it was not easy to create, and even though he looked stupid, he was not deprived of talent. The Star Sword frowned. He realized that most likely the reason such a gifted guy came to the academy was to use his granddaughter. Looking at the protagonist, he asked him again about who he was. The guy greeted him and introduced himself. Smiling, he said that he had only seen him on the internet and it was just amazing that he was finally able to see him in real life, thinking that it was incredibly scary because he could not even imagine that Saiyan's grandfather would come here. Looking at the man, he asked him if he had come to see her, but added that she had gone out on some business, but the Star Sword cried out, not understanding why he was calling her that. He frowned when he heard the boy's question about whether he had come to see Saiyan. Looking at him, he asked him why he was still standing, but the boy could not understand what he was talking about. Continuing to look, he explained that his killing intent, which was in the air, paralyzed anyone below S class. The hero began to look around, assuming that he could resist her because of his unwavering heart. The man asked him what the boy wanted here. Bowing his head, he replied that he did not understand the Star Sword. Coming closer, the man explained that with such talent, he would have been accepted into any academy, but he decided to get closer to Saiyan, also asking why he did this. Minchell's aura spread throughout the hall and he told him not to even think about lying. The boy stretched out his hands and shouted that they most likely misunderstood each other. He looked at the man while he was saying that he didn't expect to get an answer so easily. The Star Sword made a strike. He narrowed his eyes because the boy was able to dodge. The hero's eyes widened. Small buildings were visible. A question was heard about whether the grandfather had really left. Seon, standing in front of the girl, asked when he would return, but she answered that he hadn't said exactly, suggesting to call the chairman, hoping that he knew more. The girl's face looked upset. She thought that she was just about to tell him about Seojun. The man stood over the boy, telling him to answer his question. The hero took the spear in his hands while the opponent asked about his goal. The girl, with wide eyes, asked whether the grandfather had really left. The woman stood in front of her. She answered affirmatively. Sweat appeared on Seyun's face because she wanted to keep everything a secret for as long as possible, but after participating in the tournament, hiding Seojun would no longer be possible. A man stood behind them. The girl agreed to call the chairman. It was Munchel. He said that he was very glad to meet him because Seyun had not dropped by here for a long time. The woman bowed, saying that she was about to call him, but he did not understand why. The chairman pursed his lips when she said that she came to see her grandfather. Her eyes widened when he answered that he was heading to her academy. She began to run. The woman, resting her head on her hand, asked where she was running so fast. Seyun ran as fast as she could, not understanding how she could have let her guard down so much, because she knew that he would come, but she just hoped that it would not be so soon. She ran with her eyes wide open, understanding that she must not allow these two to meet. The boy's face was sweating. The Star Sword was looking at him with a frown. It was looking at something without understanding. The boy noticed that the man had not pulled the sword out of its sheath. Kneeling, the protagonist realized that the man was not trying to kill him, but rather just subdue him. He began to approach him with his arms outstretched. The opponent asked him who he really was, to which the boy replied that he really did not understand what he wanted, because he must have misunderstood something. He opened his mouth wide when the man noted that he could control mana. Bowing his head, he explained that he moved perfectly in battle and still continued to claim that he had misunderstood something. He made another blow, shouting that the man was blatantly lying to his face without even thinking. Jumping back, the hero exclaimed that he did not know what Seiyan told him, asking the man to calm down. The guy's eyes turned white when he called him a scoundrel. He thought that maybe he said something wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The man's eyes were glowing blue. He said that he was going to talk about everything, take into account the circumstances that brought the hero here, but the hero understood that he was lying and he was not going to talk about anything with him. The guy lowered his head. Taking a stance, he decided to fight back. Frowning, he understood that he would not listen to him, but his movements made it clear that no matter what he said, he would not kill him. He imagined his image, understanding that if the Star Sword really wanted to kill him, it would do it the moment it felt the guy's presence. He prepared to strike, knowing that this was the person closest to his ideals. Smiling, the young man understood that he had just a wonderful chance. The man frowned. He looked at the guy, noticing that his mood had changed. His eyes widened. He knew very well that he had seen many hunters. The hero's eye did not even tremble, and Minchel realized that only he looked into his eyes without fear. Sajin lowered his spear a little, and the man continued to think that he must be very strong. He struck at the hero, not understanding what he wanted from his granddaughter. The young man blocked the blows, but did not see them or even feel them. His eyes widened. The Star Sword hung over him. Gritting his teeth, he realized that he did not notice such a simple blow because its strength was beyond the hero's understanding. He blocked blow after blow. Instantly, he lunged to attack. The man squinted, looking at this. His sword was already flying towards the boy. Throwing it away, he said that it was a banality. The hero lay on the ground while he explained that he only needed to answer. Sajin did not understand what he was missing, because it was impossible for everything to end like this. Getting up from the floor, he knew that tricks would not help. Kneeling down, he decided that as long as the opponent was not serious, he had a chance. The Star Sword was already in front of him, and the hero knew that everything had to be finished with one blow. He looked at the man with wide eyes, not understanding how to do this. He dodged the first blow. The guy began to lunge for a blow. As he swung, he remembered Merlin's words about using mana, subjugating willpower, so that he could deceive the world, because the figment of his imagination obeys the laws of nature. His weapon was covered in a blue glow. After making a swing, he realized that he was not capable of more now. He hit his opponent. Immediately after, the hero fell to his knees. The man looked at him. The guy sat, wiping his face, when the Star Sword called him a scoundrel. He was shouting at the guy with his eyes wide open that he had finally shown his true colors, but he still didn't understand what he was talking about since the man had attacked first. His eyes turned white from the hero's words that his words were only making it more painful and asking when Seiyan would return. He was approaching the guy to attack, saying that he was asking for it. He was saying with his eyes wide open that he would personally send him to the next world. The hero clenched his teeth and realized that he was finished. The girl burst into the hall, shouting for them to stop. She looked at them, asking them what they had done here. Her face looked tired. Star Sword closed his eyes. Saiyan asked the guy how he was, noticing that he was covered in bruises, but he replied that it was probably nothing serious, but it still hurt. Minchel turned away and said how could such a weakling call himself a man? But the hero replied that it didn't matter if it was a man or a woman, but even so, it would hurt anyone if they were hit by a Star Sword. Seojin hid behind the girl when the man asked him to repeat what he said, but the hero exclaimed that he would really beat him again. The girl watched this silently. The guy, peeking out from behind Saiyan, asked the man why he did this to him, because if he had such a title, he could do whatever he wanted. She understood that no one had spoken to her grandfather like that before. Putting out her hand, the girl told her grandfather to stop. With wide eyes, she apologized to the guy, who replied that it was nothing, because it was just a few bruises and there was nothing wrong with it. She bowed, adding that she would explain everything later. The guy's eyes widened. The girl stood with her head bowed. She bowed to him again when he said that it looked like he would have to go to the emergency room after all, so he should probably go, to which she replied that he shouldn't worry, since she would pay for the decision. She smiled when the hero said goodbye to her, mentally thanking him for understanding. The girl turned around. She went to her grandfather. Looking at him, she added that they needed to talk. They looked at each other in silence. The girl widened her eyes, realizing that although she had decided that she would tell him everything, she could not open her mouth now. The man said that Seojin was kind of suspicious, asking his granddaughter to stay away from him. Clenching her hands into fists, she replied that he was not suspicious. She squeezed her hand harder, hearing her grandfather's question about how she knew. She stood there, remembering all the times he told her that she didn't know anything, that she should listen to him. She realized that she had been listening to this her whole life because her grandfather completely ignored her opinion. Remembering her academy, she realized that even in this compromise that she had found, her grandfather interfered every now and then. She remembered how he humiliated every student, and that's why everyone eventually left, unable to bear it. She pursed her lips, knowing why he acted like this and why people kept coming here, and that's why she didn't try to stop them when they tried to leave. Minchel, lowering his head, told her to kick him out because otherwise he would do it himself. He looked at the girl when she exclaimed that she didn't want to. Without raising her head, she said that Seojin was not like that. She started screaming that she didn't want to. When her grandfather asked her again about what she had just said, she just didn't want to let him go. Leaning over, she screamed that she didn't want to, because why should she always listen to him? Without raising her head, she continued to scream that this was her academy, not his. She remembered her first meeting with the hero, realizing that even though they had nothing to remember and nothing between them, when she looked at him, she felt something strange. She remembered how happy she was to meet him, because it was with him that she wanted to be as long as possible. She still didn't raise her head when her grandfather yelled at her that it wasn't the best time to throw a tantrum, because she didn't understand who he really was, to which she responded by yelling that she didn't care. She recalled those meetings with him, yelling that she wanted to figure everything out herself. Saiyan looked at her grandfather, explaining to him that she didn't want to live in his shadow forever and she wouldn't. She widened her eyes, adding that even now, this is how it was. He looked at her without saying a word. The girl silently lowered her head. Turning around, she apologized for raising her voice. Opening the door, she explained that this time she would do as she decided. Minchel didn't move from his place. His eyes widened, because he didn't even remember her yelling at him. A memory of the dungeon opening appeared in his head. Someone was standing in front of the Star Sword, telling him that something terrible had happened. He lowered his head when he heard about his son. He squinted, looking at someone. It was little Saiyan. He remembered looking at her, because he realized that she had no one left. He remembered how he took her away, deciding that he would teach her to stand up for herself, because he had to. That was why he was so strict with her. He remembered training with her, how he shouted at her to get up, because she would never become a hunter like that, let alone reach a class, even though she loved fencing. He remembered how he stood in front of her, not wanting to let her become a teacher, even though she wanted to go down a different path. He remembered how he yelled at her, convincing her to do as he said. He remembered the fear in her eyes, because he always oppressed her. Now, as she walked away from him, he knew that it was bound to happen sooner or later, but he just didn't want to think about it. Raising his head, he realized that this was how it ended after all. Looking at the empty hall, he realized that she had rebelled after all. The power plant was visible. Someone was walking towards it. It was Seojin. Rubbing his shoulder, he said that he was already as good as new and another conversation would not be a problem. Small houses were visible. He remembered how the Star Sword lasted, saying that when it attacked him, he thought that he was a goner, but in the end he got off with minor bruises, although he also noted that it held back, and if Saiyan had come a minute later, everything could have ended much worse. Frowning, he wondered how she could have lived at all. Last night, Saiyan called the hero and told him everything. Standing by the wall, she talked about her relationship with her grandfather. Rubbing her head, she also mentioned what happened to the past students. As he imagined her in the Star Sword, he knew that she was keeping a lot of things quiet, but it was enough to understand how she felt and why her grandfather treated him like that. Looking at the academy, he thought that even though he understood him, it still didn't make his actions right. Walking up to the door, he wondered if Grandfather Saiyan would apologize to him, but he also doubted it. The hero had progressed in his lectures with Merlin and Gautama, but he knew that he would never address them again in his life. As he opened the door, he thought that it was okay to be beaten once more, and he also greeted without looking inside, to which he heard Minchel's voice that he had finally arrived. His eyes turned white. The Star Sword was sitting in front of him, telling him not to stand there like a pillar and to come in. The boy smiled nervously when he ordered him to sit down. He did not understand that he was really going to beat him again. Sitting in front of the hero, he first said that the boy and Saiyan had an agreement. Frowning, the man asked him if that was all, to which he answered affirmatively, adding that he had nothing to hide. Looking at the boy, Minchel understood that most likely he was not lying, but still did not understand where he got such talent and so much strength, because he had never seen so much power in an ordinary student. Rubbing his chin, he thought that when he got angry, the hero was not just not scared, but inspired. He asked the Star Sword if he could go. The man asked where he was going. Opening his eyes, he heard the boy's words that he was going to train, realizing that this was what he needed. The academy was visible. He understood that thanks to this he would immediately understand what he was hiding. Minchel stood there, squinting, not understanding what was going on. Looking at Sajin, he thought he was out of his mind, because he was looking at a switched-off phone, despite the fact that there was nothing on it at all. He tilted his head and turned to the boy, asking if he meditated. The boy asked again and answered that he did something like that. Crossing his arms over his chest, the man explained that although meditation was a great workout, it should not be overdone because it strengthened the mind and spirit, but not the body. He continued to look at him, not understanding what was wrong with the boy and whether the boy was not interested in what he was teaching him. Raising his hand to his face, he asked him if he wanted to learn from him a little. The boy asked if the Star Sword itself really wanted to take it up. Minchel closed his eyes and replied that he had reacted immediately, although he had simply blurted it out since the guy had hurt his pride. Although even so he could show him a couple of techniques, the guy interrupted his thoughts with his answer that he didn't need it since he was happy with everything as is. The man's expression didn't even change, and the hero asked him not to distract him anymore since if he wanted to say something, they would talk later. Saiyan opened the door and greeted the protagonist. Seeing her grandfather, she exclaimed. He approached her and said that she had come just in time, but she tried to find out why he had come. Clenching her hand into a fist, she said that if he laid a finger on her, but he interrupted her with the words that this young man was clearly not all there. Standing next to her, he told her that he didn't want Minchel to teach him. Also looking at the guy, he told her to look at what he was doing. The girl, smiling, answered that she did not see anything strange, and he exclaimed that this was really normal. He squinted at her when she said that she understood him perfectly. Smiling, she added that she used to think the same way. She approached the young man, greeting him. Turning to her, he greeted her, asking how long she had been here, and she answered that it was recently, asking how he was feeling. The man squinted, since he really did not like the protagonist. He looked at them, thinking that he was not even very smart, although Saiyan, looking at him, smiled. Continuing to look, he wondered if she really liked talking to him. Standing not far from them, he realized that he had never seen her smile like that. He watched her laugh loudly. Clenching his fist, he thought that the hero was a real bastard. Suddenly, Munchel appeared behind him and called out to Minchel, who was wondering if the guy dared to hit on his granddaughter. He turned around and asked him what was wrong, to which he replied that he had important news. Coming closer, he explained that the Truth Order was calling him, and the Star Sword asked if he was talking about the strange people. Turning away, he added that if they needed something from him, they should come themselves. He turned around abruptly when he heard Munchel say that Sir Kalia himself wanted to see him. The assistant also added, his eyes wide, that he had another request. Everyone turned to look at Sajin when he finished his words by saying that Sir Kalia wanted to see him too. Pointing his finger at himself, the hero couldn't believe it. Getting up from the floor, he asked the assistant why such a thing would be necessary. Minchel leaned towards the hero and said that he knew that the hero was one of them, otherwise they could not know about him, although the young man said that he himself was interested in knowing. The girl remembered the tournament, saying that there was a strange man in a black robe at the tournament, and perhaps he could somehow be connected with all this. The guy scratched his head while they discussed this. The Star Sword said that even in spite of this, everything was quite strange, because Kalia would hardly be interested in some ordinary person. Saiyan asked the assistant if he knew this man, but he replied that he had no idea who he was. Looking at the others, the hero asked if he had to go. The girl, presenting the order, explained that this was the Order of Truth, which included 7 apostles who stood on par with the heads of the largest states. And Sir Kalia was the successor of the Apostle of Chastity, and usually, people like him did not make personal appointments. The protagonist spread his arms and asked what business it was of his, since to him he was just a stranger like a foreigner. Minchul, lowering his head, said that that was probably why everyone thought so highly of Sir Kalia. Minchul, crossing his arms over his chest, asked what he was talking about, and he explained that he, the future apostle, knew in advance that Xiaojun would refuse his offer. The hero's eyes widened when the assistant explained that in that case, he asked to convey that if he nevertheless agreed to come, he would give the young man 100 million won. The guy, slightly lowering his head, could not believe such a sum, because how could he know that he needed exactly that much? A sign of the Order of Truth appeared, a religious organization, but it does not serve human gods, but the gods of truth. A great voice appeared, headed by 7 apostles. They convey the will of God, that is, the truth, but the Order of Truth was considered a simple cult 100 years ago. But, during that very cataclysm, the Order joined forces with the forces of the heroes, because it was thanks to them that peace reigned on Earth again, and thanks to this, the number of followers grew. But more importantly, the Berserker monster was killed by the Order, because when everyone thought that the trouble was over, a monster suddenly appeared that was so strong that even all the heroes together could not cope with it, and the situation was so desperate that it was called the Second Cataclysm. But only the Great Voice and the 7 apostles could cope with it, and it was thanks to them that the Earth was saved. A hotel on the outskirts of Seoul was visible. The hero looked at the building, thinking that it was too nondescript for a representative of a world religion, while Minchul was talking about how he had come to see Sir Kalia and wanted to introduce the hero, but he was interrupted. The robe-clad man asked him if his name was Xiaojun. Moving away from the passage, he added that they should pass, because Kalia was already waiting for them. Following the man, the hero thought about whether the man from the Order had really been at the tournament, and perhaps they had decided to replace him with the same amount as the victor, or Kalia had chosen it at random, but he still could not understand why he was watching him and why he had called him. Opening the door, the robe-clad man said that they were coming here, while the protagonist continued to think about what he might know about the No, or maybe about the Academy of Transcendentals. In front of them was a luxurious room. The messenger of the Order told them that Sir Kalia would be there soon, asking them to wait here. The hero decided to find out everything now. With his head down, Minchul said that he knew that it would be like this, because then he would not have sat and waited for them. Stroking his beard, he listened to the guy's question about whether he was familiar with the successor of the apostle. Frowning a little, he answered that this was their first meeting. The hero could not believe it. Sitting in front of the young man, he explained that he called him a couple of times, but he did not see him personally, but added that during the cataclysm he met the Apostle of Chastity, but he has not yet met his successor. The hero opened his mouth, arguing that after all, Minchul is one of those who saved the world, although for him he is more like Grandfather Saiyan, but even so he remains a Star Sword, and this should not be forgotten. The man leaned his elbow on the armrest and listened to the boy's question about whether he had seen the Great Voice, since he had heard that it had only appeared in public during the battle with the Berserker. The man remembered its image. The hero stared at it when he heard a negative answer. Resting his head on his hand, he added that he had only seen it from afar. Suddenly, the boy turned around, hearing something behind him. The successor of the apostle had entered the room and thanked them for their visit. The man looked at him, and Kalia asked him if this was the first meeting. Minchul replied that he had called them himself and in the end made them wait. The boy stood before them. He was the successor of the Apostle of Chastity. Kalia smiled broadly and explained that he needed time to purify his body and mind before preaching the word of God. After bowing, the Apostle's successor apologized for the belated introduction and introduced himself as a member of the Order of Truth, who preached the word of God and followed chastity. The protagonist raised his eyebrows in surprise when she thanked him for coming. There was a chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Xiaojun asked how they knew each other. The priest realized that they needed to clear up some misunderstandings before moving on to the main topic, and asked if the student had participated in the recent academic competition. The saint put his hand to his chest and said that he wanted to see for himself how strong he was. The guy narrowed his eyes in disbelief and asked if he really knew about him like that. Kalia closed his eyes and smiled. The young man assumed that he had some other reason for meeting him in person. The heroes sat down at the table. The conversation was about exploring the dungeons. Holding a cup of tea in his hands, the apostle's successor hoped for the cooperation of the Star Sword during the exploration. Minchul opened his mouth wide and asked why he would do that. The priest explained that his colleague knew better than anyone that this was far from the end. The man frowned sternly and asked what they were talking about. The student silently watched their conversation. The saint told him that there was a report of a distortion in one of the dungeons in Korea. The old man put his hand on his knee and thought about it when she stated that this was the decision of the Order of Truth and that they absolutely had to check the state of the dungeon. Star Sword narrowed his eyes and suggested that this was why the blonde man had flown to Korea to strengthen his position. Kalia brought the mug to his mouth and nodded slightly. The successor of the apostle realized that he was not so easy to fool. Minchel leaned back on the sofa and said that it was impudent of him to say that this was the decision of the Order of Truth, because it was not even funny. The priest put the cup on the table and asked if his colleague could help him. The man replied that it depended on what they were willing to give him. The old man rested his elbow on the arm of the sofa. The saint realized that he would not be given a favor here and remembered that his granddaughter founded the Hunter Academy. At these words, the Star Sword sternly knitted his brows. A dark aura appeared in the room, so strong that the protagonist's entire body went numb. Sajin's eyes widened in surprise and thought that this was the true form of murderous intent. Minchel flashed his fiery eyes and threatened to kill the guest if he tried to involve San here again. Kalia lowered his gaze and realized that he had made a mistake. The man's lips trembled as an apology followed these words. The dark aura in the room dissipated. The apostle's successor said that he had nothing more to offer and decided to exchange a favor for a favor. The old man asked him if he could be trusted, because tomorrow the blonde could say that there was no deal. The heroes looked at each other. The priest said that he could give him an oath in the name of the Order of Truth. Star Sword asked if this would be enough to determine the place of the apostle. The saint replied that after this he would definitely not be able to lie. In the end, Minchel agreed and they shook hands. Xiajin flinched when he was called out. The saint turned to him and explained that the Order of Truth wanted to become his sponsor and help him with various things that the academy could not take care of. The boy frowned and asked what he would need to do if the order became his sponsor. Kalia closed his eyes and said that they would not ask for anything in return and that it would be enough for them to be close. The heroes sat in a spacious office. The boy asked what would happen if he refused. The successor of the apostle said that then they could not do anything about it. The student decided that such a thing did not happen and that they would still want to receive payment for their services. The hunter said that this offer did not appeal to him and promised to think about it if the member of the order answered his question honestly. The priest smiled and asked what interested him. The protagonist opened his mouth furiously and was about to ask a question, but stopped. The saint looked at him with a smile. Sajin realized that he would not be able to find out the answer if he lied or evaded the answer, and asking directly was too suspicious. The guy put his hand in his pocket. The young man showed the guest his phone. The student grinned and asked if he saw anything on the screen of this smartphone. Kalia squinted in displeasure. Gautama was depicted on the screen. Some believe that the soul determines who a person really is, and that even after death and reincarnation, the essence of being must remain the same. Holding the phone in his hand, the hunter repeated his question. The protagonist opened his mouth in surprise when the successor of the apostle said that this was a very strange question and that it was too difficult for him to answer it. Sajin pulled his hand away and said that he couldn't do anything if the guest didn't want to answer his question. The boy frowned when the priest said that he saw a black screen. The saint clasped his hands and asked if he was satisfied with this answer. The answer was affirmative. The boy closed his eyes. Kalia asked him to think again about accepting the sponsorship. The student smiled and said that he refused it. Night fell. The successor of the apostle stood by the window. The priest asked how everything went. The man in the robe approached him and said that they were unable to find any distortions. The saint asked if they had checked everything for sure. Kalkos spread his arms and swore in the name of the Order of Truth. Biting his thumbnail, the blonde thought that the unremarkable student's question about the smartphone screen had caught him off guard and wondered what this nagging feeling was left in his chest. The boy said that he needed to report to another apostle, crossing his arms over his chest. Kalia asked him to continue observing the distortions and asked what happened to the other heroes. The apostle's successor looked down thoughtfully when the young man answered that he had called everyone except Soul Blade and Dark Sword, who had not been seen for a long time. A hand holding a smartphone surfaced in his memory. The protagonist was walking down the street of a night city. Someone asked him why he refused the priest's offer. Xiajin approached his comrade and replied that it looked too suspicious. Minchel asked what it meant. The boy thought that he didn't know what the Order of Truth really was and didn't want to make a practically free deal with such suspicious individuals. The man assumed that his granddaughter's academy didn't bother him at all. The boy shrugged and replied that there was no one more honest than Xiajin in this world. The old man's brows furrowed sternly when the boy asked him what the concept of dungeon distortion meant. It turned out that it meant that the magic inside it was distorted. A bright flash appeared in the starry sky. This happens because the difficulty of the dungeon is different from the value it had when it was formed. Such dungeons have many side effects and very often break through early. The student asked how this was even possible. The hunter shuddered in surprise when Star Sword explained to him that now such things can be seen extremely rarely, but during the cataclysm such things happened very often. The protagonist asked what Kalia meant by "it's not over yet." Minchul turned away and asked him not to worry so much since the cataclysm had long since ended. Seojin pointed his hand in the other direction, where the academy was, and asked where his comrade was going. The man replied that he didn't need to know. Suddenly, the old man stopped. His eyes turned white. The star sword threatened to kill the student if he tried to do something strange to his granddaughter. The stars were shining in the sky. The guy assumed that this meant that the teacher recognized him. Minchul said that this meant that he was watching him. Then the young man asked if this was why Seojin was distancing himself from him. The man frowned furiously. His mind rope broke. His body was covered in fire. The student laughed and decided to quickly retreat. The stars illuminated the night city. The old man thought that the student was right about something. There was a sign on the building. The hunter was upset that the star sword always used force when they disagreed. The protagonist returned home and decided that he needed to quickly become stronger to confront him. Soyun approached him and asked him where her grandfather was. Seojin replied that Minchul was walking with him, but then changed his mind and went the other way. The girl asked if he said anything strange. The guy opened his mouth in surprise and answered negatively, asking her not to worry about it. The heroes looked at each other. The woman explained that her grandfather had a very bad character and apologized for not telling her about it sooner. Her eyes widened when the young man replied that there was nothing wrong with the way a man expresses his emotions. Scratching the back of his head, the student suggested that the old man could change at any moment, and noted that he only received a few blows from him if he did something terrible. The hunter thought he was talking nonsense, but Soyun just smiled and thanked him. The heroes awkwardly stood in front of each other. The girl remembered that her friend needed money. The protagonist replied that he had not told her about it and asked how she knew about it. The woman raised her index finger and remembered all the situations in which her friend simply screamed about how much he needed money. Seojin thought that this was indeed an important issue, since the 100 million that Kalia gave him went to pay off debts. His eyes turned white from the amount of expenses he needed to make. Soyun took out her phone and told him that she found a suitable task for him during his absence. The guy took his phone and saw a poster for a dungeon clearing competition. The protagonist looked at the 300 million prize with his mouth open. Suddenly he pointed at the screen and asked what it was, to which Saiyan leaned over and said that it looked like some kind of dungeon raid contest that no one could handle. Then the guy asked if it was a raid, to which the girl replied that it was probably the wrong dungeons. Seojin looked at his friend with surprise in his eyes. He lowered his head and said, and really, adding in his head that if those awakened during the cataclysm had a sense of responsibility for their country or faith, then professional hunters now only seek profit. Saiyan spread her hand to the side and said that unprofitable and abandoned dungeons are mostly low-ranked, and they are harder to attack. Then she imagined a bright light and many monsters, and then said that if the dungeons are not cleared quickly, they will explode after a while, releasing monsters, so no matter how low-ranked the monsters are, they will still pose a threat to society. At first, such dungeons were monitored by state hunters, but it was ineffective to send them to such a seedy place, and in the end, the state solved this problem in another way. After listening to the girl, the protagonist pointed to the phone and asked if they should have a dungeon clearing competition, right? To which she replied, exactly. Then with an extended finger, she said that the dungeons are just a level that even an ordinary student can handle. Anyway, with the strength of the students now more than enough to handle them, and they also said that the results will be reflected in the ranking of the Hunter Academy. Looking at the phone, Seojin replied that he did not know who came up with this, but he was a genius. Suddenly, hearing the girl say that she thought he could win easily, the protagonist looked at her in surprise and said to himself that the win was 300 million. And in addition, you can increase the progressive lectures as you progress through the raid, so there is no reason to refuse. After these thoughts, he smiled widely and said that he will participate, to which Saiyan said that she thought so, after which she added that then she will apply. Watching the girl take his phone, Seojin said in his head that he knows what she wanted most likely, she was looking for information on how to raise the Academy's rating and came across something like this. After these thoughts, he looked away. Remembering his past opponent, he sat down on the floor and thought that considering the opponents of the opponents from the last game, one can guess that it will not be easy, but this time he will definitely get them. Rising to his feet, he turned to the girl, asked how exactly the competition is going. Then Soyun presented many dots on the map and explained that it lasts for 1 week, and when the competition starts, the government will send a list of dungeons to the participants. She then crossed her fingers and said that the participants can then check the list and reserve the dungeon they want to clear through the app. They have 10 hours to clear it, and they can only reserve it once, otherwise the reservation will be cancelled. She closed her eyes and added that in short, the one who clears the most dungeons the fastest will win. After listening to the girl, the protagonist put his hand to his chin and said to himself that speed is life, to which she replied, yes, it's not for nothing that they say that oil prices are getting higher every day. Without giving up, the protagonist said that it was difficult, to which she asked what he meant, after which Seojin replied that after the raid, you need to get rid of the corpses, but if the speed of execution is a priority, then. The girl suddenly put her hand to her head and said, no, there's no need to get rid of them, since they won't give much money anyway, though. She suddenly spread her arms in shock and screamed, asking if he was really going to get rid of them on his own this time too, to which the guy asked if that wasn't part of the rules. Without lowering her hands, Seiun screamed, no, asking after how much can she talk, to which the main character folded his arms across his chest and said that if he collected them all, it would make a lot of money. So why throw away these precious things? After which the girl screamed that winning was much more important, to which Seojin replied that that's why he said it would be more difficult. The girl slightly lowered her head. The guy put his hand to his chin and said that if only the priorities were different. Suddenly he lowered his hand and, looking at his partner, asked her to wait. Picking up the phone, he asked what the rules were. A few days later, the weather was very nice outside. The day of the competition had arrived. On the main character's phone screen, there was a system screen that reported that the lecture progress had loaded to 50%. Looking at this, the guy said in his head that given that every 10% you can see certain changes, then something else is needed. Seiun suddenly approached him, asking him if he downloaded the application, to which he replied, yes, I prepared everything important yesterday. The girl folded her arms across her chest and asked if his assistant hadn't arrived yet, to which Seojin came closer and replied no, but he found the way easily, adding that this was not a joke, because if finding the way was an ability, then even the Star Sword could not compare to him. Despite his appearance, he is very charming. At this time, a man was walking towards them. Seeing him, the main character began to wave his hands and shout that they were here. When the man came closer, he raised his hand behind his head and asked him in confusion why he was yelling. They were not at home, to which the guy replied that he thought he was late, but he came even earlier. The man looked at the guy's confused smile, asking if he said what would happen for being late. Opening his mouth, he quietly said, and the comrade put his hands on his hips, wondering what he would have to do. A few days ago, the man talked to the main character on the phone, asking if they really had to work on the same team. He was at a loss, asking if the guy really wanted his comrade to drag the corpses of monsters left after the competition and be a driver, to which Seojin replied with a smile that after that he would definitely pay. He suddenly leaned his elbows against the bed, adding, to be more precise, he will be the one dragging, and the man will be cutting up, and every second is important. The comrade walked away from his colleagues, saying that the offer was not bad, but would they be able to handle it if speed was so important? He said that if the guy was taking care of him like that, then there was no need, when suddenly the protagonist smiled, saying that he needed his uncle, thinking that the work of cutting up corpses that brought in money required skills, but if it was his uncle, then the guy could vouch for him. Suddenly, a message came to Seojin's phone. It said that the dungeon clearing competition was starting, after which he notified the guys. The guy turned to his uncle, shouting that they could begin, and that they would see Seiun later, to which the girl raised her hand, wishing them luck. Holding a spear in his hands, the protagonist asked if his uncle knew the rules, to which the man replied that he remembered everything, so there was no need to worry. Seojin buckled up and added that the winner would be the one who cleared the most dungeons, so winning depended on their speed, and in this competition, two things were needed. He looked at the man and said that the first was to clear the dungeon as quickly as possible, and then raised his fingers, adding that the second was to get to the dungeon as quickly as possible. The protagonist started scrolling through his phone, explaining that most of the dungeons were tier 1 or 2, and depending on the tier. The raid time would also differ, but he was ready for any dungeon, and all that was needed from the uncle was to get to the dungeon as quickly as possible. The man's eyes widened as he picked up the phone. Taking a closer look, he asked what it was, to which Seojin replied that it was a list of dungeons and their locations. Without taking his eyes off him, the protagonist asked if the man could plan a route that would minimize the travel time between dungeons, which scared the uncle. The guy laughed, saying that the comrade was much faster and more accurate than navigation. The man moved from his place, asking to hold on tightly. Inspector Sujin yawned. She looked at the dungeon, saying that the person who just entered was Seojin from Dream Academy. She looked at the paper, thinking that since the guy was from some unknown academy, he must be a weak student who could handle it in an hour. The girl looked up at the man, thinking that at first she was nervous that they would cheat, but the comrade just stayed outside, so there was no problem with that. She wondered if the man was an ordinary driver, then noticed a strange glow from the gate. Sujin came closer to them, when suddenly Seojin looked outside, asking the comrade to get ready because he was finished. The man smiled, saying that the guy was fast, when suddenly the girl screamed in fear that the rules forbade outsiders from interfering with the dungeon raid. The protagonist turned to her, answering that he knew, but the raid was already over. The inspector's face changed in bewilderment, To which Sajin smiled, answering that he had already completely cleared the dungeon, which she could verify for herself. Sujin clenched her hand into a fist, loudly shouting that this could not be. A few seconds later, they were standing in front of the corpses of monsters. The inspector thought in confusion that not even 10 minutes had passed, while the protagonist was heading for the exit. The girl turned back, warily asking what he was doing now. The guy and his uncle began to speed up, asking the girl not to pay attention. The man turned around in displeasure, asking if Sajin was still doing this madness. The protagonist lowered the monster to the ground, answering that no matter what, he could not skip the tasks because in addition to the main task, there were side ones. Having laid out the bag with tools, the guy asked how long it would take, to which the uncle replied that the monsters were low level and there were few profitable parts, so cutting up one path would take 15 seconds. Sajin smiled, asking to begin, when suddenly Sujin appeared behind them, asking with a trembling voice if they were really going to cut up a corpse. Sajin turned to her and asked if there were any problems, to which the girl frowned, shouting loudly, "Of course." Opening her mouth, the girl answered from confusion that there were no problems with this, when suddenly the protagonist asked what the complaints were. The guy with a smile on his face put the monsters on his shoulders, starting to squat with them. Without a tremor in his hands, the man immediately cut off the head of another one of them. The inspector stood nearby, in complete shock. The boys threw their bags over their shoulders, arguing that there was another dungeon in the area, not as close, but compared to the others, it was the closest, so they could go there right away. Sujin watched them go, confusedly asking what she had just seen. With a ringing laugh, the boys got into the car, happily driving to their next destination. A butterfly slowly landed on his finger. The man looked at her with a wide smile on his face and said that it was very nice to relax after a long day of work at the computer. He wanted to stay here forever and then asked himself when the participants who had booked the dungeon would arrive. As soon as he said this, a large car entered the turn at high speed. The boys immediately ran out of there, shouting, "Forward!" There were many skeletons in the dungeon. The main character extended his hand with a spear and said that he would quickly deal with them. Having said this, he carried out a powerful circular attack. After that, he gave the bones to Manchul, saying that he had brought him another batch. The dungeon supervisor watched with his mouth open as the man dealt with them. Looking the other way, he saw Xiajin throw the skeletons on himself. With loud screams, they ran towards the car. They got in and drove away quickly. The supervisor watched them go, not understanding anything. Evening came, and a voice could be heard in the tall building asking if Deputy Kim had finished the report on today's competition. In the office of the dungeon management team of the Ministry of Public Administration and Security, the man looked up and said yes, adding that he had left them on his desk. At his desk, the man picked up the report. Turning to Seo Yeon's page, he read that she had cleared 16 dungeons, and said that with that many, she would definitely get first place. But turning the page, the man saw that she was only in second place. He looked at it in surprise, wondering if someone had cleared 17. Then he read that Sajin was in first place, having cleared 32 dungeons. The man immediately raised his hand and turned to Deputy Kim. When the latter approached him, he asked if he was sure he hadn't made a mistake in the report, since he had cleared 32 dungeons in first place. But was it possible to do that even in a whole day? The office was brightly lit, and the deputy replied that he didn't believe it either at first, but after asking everyone, it turned out that everything was correct. They moved between dungeons extremely carefully without losing a second, and besides, according to the inspectors, the raid didn't last more than 10 minutes. Hearing this, the man opened his mouth in shock, then asked if it was really 10 minutes, adding that even if it was a first or second level dungeon, it would still take at least 30 minutes for a student, not counting travel and rest time, and was he really a student, and was he really not helped by anyone? Everyone in the office turned their heads in surprise, while the deputy said that he checked this first, but no rules were broken. The man lowered his head and asked if he was really not lying, and which academy he was from, to which Kim replied that he was from Dream Academy, which was located near Seoul in the Yunpyong district. Hearing this, the man raised his head in surprise, then asked if this was the academy founded by the granddaughter of the Star Sword. Kim folded his arms and replied in confusion that it was, adding that he was wondering where he heard this name from. After this, the colleagues looked at each other in confusion. Throwing the report on the table, the man asked if the Star Sword had participated in raids, to which Kim replied that he would check right away. After a while, Soyeon from the East Academy was told that she did not have first place, to which she closed her eyes and apologized. A man sat at the table not far from her and asked her displeasedly if she really thought that a simple apology would be enough, adding that their academy would suffer great losses if he did not get first place this time, to which the girl replied that she would do everything possible to win. Then suddenly the man asked her how she thought a person could clear 32 dungeons, to which Soyeon opened her eyes in surprise. She looked ahead and said in her head that if raids were completed every 10 minutes, but even so, given the distance between dungeons, it was impossible. The man stood up and said that he thought it was possible if someone helped him. Turning to the window, he ordered Soyeon to do what she had done before and he would take care of the rest himself, and the girl said to herself that his reaction told her that he was going to take the path of deception. Seokman, a former rank hunter, the current director of the East Academy and Soyeon's father, turned to her and asked if something was bothering her. Looking at her, he told her not to worry about it, because in the end, this is the law of life where the smartest survive, because it is important who wins and not who is right. The girl silently looked at her father. Suddenly, the director asked her if she was worried about him, to which Soyeon looked away and replied that she was not. From the very large building of the East Academy, Seokman's voice was heard, saying that he did not think that his daughter would act as stupidly as this idiot, to which the girl replied that she would not let him down. The girl slowly walked down the corridor. Suddenly, she stopped abruptly, a memory of the protagonist smiling and telling her that if she was a professional hunter, there must be something in her heart that she should never compromise on. Soyeon turned around, asking in confusion who else thought that way. After all, isn't money everything? To which Seokjin laughed, saying that if money overshadowed her heart, the world would never seem the same, so he would become a pro hunter who would make people's hearts tremble. Soyeon's expression changed, saying that no one else should hear this, even people would laugh at it, even she would be very ashamed. She lowered her head as the protagonist's words suddenly flashed through her mind. Does she ever feel ashamed? Soyeon looked up, noticing Seokjin's outline. The protagonist was smiling gently. The girl clenched her teeth tightly, angrily saying that since he was dead, he should leave her alone. She clenched her fists, quickly quickening her pace. Sitting under the street lamp, the man said that his whole body hurt. The protagonist smiled, saying that he tried hard, when suddenly the uncle asked if the next week would be the same, to which the guy sarcastically asked if the man really liked to pretend. The uncle frowned, menacingly asking if Seokjin had ever driven a car, making up a route on the go, because it was a real headache, after which the protagonist laughed, asking if the man thought about money, didn't the pain go away on its own? He looked at his phone, saying that if you don't take into account expenses and taxes, they made about 8 million won. The guy turned to the side, adding that if you divide 50-50, it will come to about 4 million for each. The uncle frowned, answering that 30% would be enough for him, and 70% for the protagonist, since he had done all the work, to which the guy exclaimed that the driver's work was much more significant. The uncle closed his eyes, ordering him to do as he said, otherwise he would not go out tomorrow, after which Seokjin exhaled heavily, saying that 30% would be an ugly number, so he would have to give 2.5 million won. The man was surprised, asking why the number was ugly, when suddenly the guy asked him to just take what they gave him, since without him, such a profit was only worth dreaming about. The uncle thoughtfully took a sip of his drink, answering, okay. The protagonist turned towards him and asked if the man was not surprised at all. He looked around, said that he was talking about the guy quickly clearing the dungeons. The man looked menacingly into the distance, answering that he had already seen the guy at the academic competitions, which surprised the protagonist greatly, shouting that the uncle could have at least called that he had come. The uncle exhaled, saying that he didn't want to burden him, which made the boy smile. Looking at Manchul, he thought that his uncle was a good person, and although he was a straightforward person, he always encouraged him, because after the loss of his parents, Seokjin had to pay off his debts himself, and his uncle took care of him, becoming a great support. He turned to Manchul, asking if he was thinking about opening a transportation company, to which the man asked where he would get the money for such a thing, and was the guy really capable of opening a company, which made Seokjin smile, saying that he would be able to in the future, and the uncle exhaled, asking him not to bother his head with it now. On the second day of the competition, reporters pointed to the guys, saying that they were the same famous dungeon diggers. Manchul spread his arms wide, asking what nonsense, to which the guy exclaimed, answering that they were nicknamed that way since in addition to the raid, they managed to cut up the corpses of monsters, and in fact, they are talked about a lot. His gaze met Seokjin, and he added that he made sure that there were no problems, so the guys can continue what they were doing. After some time, the sign said that Seokjin cleared 41 more dungeons. The guy put his hand on his hip, saying that at this rate, victory is not far off, when suddenly his uncle added that if they do not win, it will be at least strange. Seokjin smiled, shouting that there are 5 days left, so they need to cheer up, to which Manchul was indignant that he will not rest. The protagonist said that he would treat the man to something delicious if they won, when suddenly Manchul asked incredulously if the guy was really trying to eat rich people's food now and could afford it, which made Seokjin smile and answer of course, after which he asked to grab Seokjin since he hadn't seen her for a long time. Manchul put his hand on the guy's shoulder, shouting that he would have to buy a whole cow. The guy looked at his phone, thinking that everything was going smoothly and he had a good feeling, since now he simply had to win. On the third day of the competition, the uncle was thoughtfully looking at his phone. The protagonist came closer, asking what happened, when suddenly Manchel handed him the phone, asking to take a look. Seojin's eyes widened in surprise. Looking at the map, he screamed, asking if there really wasn't a single free dungeon left around. Looking at his phone, the protagonist was saying in his head that the nearest dungeon was at least an hour away, and they only reserved the places that were near him. Could it really be a coincidence? Manchel folded his arms and asked the guy if he thought all this was suspicious. He also said that this was against the rules, so he was sure that the reservations would be removed soon, adding that his instinct told him that this was not an accident. And the protagonist climbed into the car, saying that they did not know for sure yet, so they first needed to get to the nearest dungeon. But after the next dungeon, the same thing happened, which made Manchel scream across the street, could it really be the same thing? As a result, the table wrote that he only organized 10 raids and Soyeon 25. Seojin looked at his phone and said that something very strange was happening. His uncle threw up his hands and asked what was strange about that, since Seoyeon was in second place, so he was sure that it was her doing. To which Seoyeon replied that the app could tell who had booked the dungeons, but not these ones, so she would contact the organizers. At this time, the protagonist raised his hand to his chin and said to himself that he was in first place, although it was only the third day, and if the same thing was repeated constantly, he would lose. After these thoughts, he turned to his uncle and said that he thought that cutting up corpses was not so important now, to which he replied that winnings were much more important. But still, no matter how quickly he cleared the dungeons, the distance was inevitable, so he would try to plan the route as accurately as possible. Hearing this, the guy again raised his hand to the selection, thinking. After a short pause, he looked at the guys and said that he had a plan. Putting up his finger, he asked what if they did this. The next day, there were a lot of people in the park. They were standing next to each other while the man in the suit was loudly talking about how they needed to be on guard and that once the guy named Seojin booked a dungeon, they needed to book all the dungeons closest to him, to which the guys replied that they were looking closely at their phones. Then the guy in the hat suddenly asked how Seojin would raid, to which his comrade asked how it made any difference to him since the main thing was that they were getting paid. Suddenly the man in the suit raised his hands and shouted loudly for everyone to get ready since the main character had booked a dungeon, adding that like yesterday, they were booking all the dungeons within an hour's drive of him, but booking them all at once would be suspicious, so they would do it gradually over the course of 10 minutes while he was redoubting. The guy turned to the guy in the hat and told him not to forget to pay, to which he chuckled and said that he knew about it so there was no need to worry about it. When suddenly he stood in a stupor, and his comrade asked in shock what. The man in the suit dropped his hands and asked in surprise what happened, to which the guys asked what they should do, because the main character booked a dungeon right next to Son. Hearing this, the agent snatched the phone and one of the guys. While he was looking at the screen, the guys were saying that if they booked dungeons, it would also affect Son. After which another of the guys asked if it was impossible to cancel the reservation when the raid ended. But according to the rules, you can't cancel the reservation within 10 hours if you don't complete the raid. At this time, the agent suddenly shook. At this time, the slime in the dungeon was killed with one blow. Son walked forward, waving her sword. After a while, the car stopped. Son was sitting inside and said that it was time to go to the next dungeon, to which the driver said that not even 15 minutes had passed. When suddenly he froze, not knowing what to say. Seojin looked at him and asked him discontentedly why he wasn't going, to which the man replied that all the dungeons around were booked, so he didn't know where to go now. Hearing this, the girl was very surprised. At the end of the day, the ranking reported that the protagonist had cleared 15 dungeons and Seojin 13. Seojin remembered the map and said to himself that at first he thought it was a coincidence, but it turned out that it wasn't, so he booked next to it, but because of this he would also lose a lot, but now the ranking would be stable. When Seojin came to her father's office, he stood up from his chair and said that he knew she would notice, but he didn't expect such a reaction from her. But she didn't have to worry, because he had already thought of another way, so she should continue in the same spirit. Hearing this, the girl closed her eyes and quietly replied, "Okay." The 5th day of the competition came, and Seojin was already standing in front of the dungeon. The protagonist and his uncle met her, and Manchel, folding his arms, said that this was their comrade in misfortune. The inspector saw this and said that quarrels between the participants were prohibited, and that breaking the rules would result in disqualification. To which the protagonist pointed to the dungeon and said that they were not arguing, it was just that their dungeons were close. Soyeon looked at the guy and asked if he was really Seojin, to which the protagonist smiled and asked if she was really Soyeon. Coming closer, the protagonist said that whoever won, everything should be fair between them, because even though this was a competition, didn't it start with good intentions? The girl tensed up, answering that listening to the guy, one could conclude that she was playing unfairly, after which Seojin laughed, saying that this was not what he meant. Closing his eyes, he walked past her. Son looked at his back, wondering if the guy really had good intentions. She lowered her head, adding that it was a joke because she was hearing about good intentions for the first time, since such a concept does not exist in this world. She knew that people were selfish by nature, and whatever they did, their actions were based on personal gain, helping when it was beneficial for them and then abandoning. The girl grabbed her sword, thinking that there was no place for good intentions in this cycle. Son headed towards the monsters, saying that they needed to be dealt with quickly. After some time, she went outside, while the guy smiled, saying that he had heard rumors, but seeing it with his own eyes, he realized that it was simply unimaginable. Son turned to the side in surprise. She watched in horror as the protagonist and his uncle quickly butchered the monsters. Her gaze met Sajun's, and he suddenly asked if the girl had finished the raid, since she was faster than he thought. The guy sheepishly pointed to the portal, asking if she didn't want the corpses, could they take them? After a few seconds of thought, Soyeon allowed them to do whatever they wanted, when suddenly the protagonist began to thank her. The girl stood in place, looking ahead intently. She frowned, looking after the guy running away with the monsters. Without taking her eyes off the protagonist, Soyeon asked what he was doing, when suddenly Sajun turned around, asking if she was talking about exercise. The protagonist smiled, asking if she was talking about corpses, since they bring in a lot of money, which made the girl look at him from under her brows. She turned around abruptly, saying that it was a waste of time. The girl walked forward, thinking that there was no place for good intentions in this world, as well as hunters with good intentions, after which she remembered her brother's words, thinking that the time had come when anyone could become a pro hunter, because over time it had become a common profession. The girl confidently walked towards the car. A loud explosion was heard from the ground, throwing mana upward. Minchul held onto his sword, asking Kalia if he hadn't said that this was a 6th level dungeon. Standing on the dragon's head, he menacingly asked why there were 10th level monsters here. Kalia put his hand to his chin, saying that when measured, it was definitely level 6, and perhaps Durek appeared here due to distortion. To which Minchul replied that this was nonsense, because distortion could not appear in this way, so he believed more that this was the work of the Truth Order. He frowned, menacingly adding, just like 30 years ago. Kalia looked at him, saying that he understood the concerns completely, but he swears on the honor of the Order of Truth that they did not do it. When suddenly a female voice was heard from behind, ordering him not to dare to start a fight in front of her. Jimin adjusted her hat, saying that she would also investigate this phenomenon, when suddenly Minchul asked in confusion what she was making a fuss about and why she was here in the first place. The girl frowned, telling her grandfather that he himself knew that the master was not in good health. The man began to complain, when suddenly Jimin loudly shouted that his manner of speech had not changed with age. A stream of mana appeared in the air, which the girl felt, saying that it did not seem like a distortion. Jimin turned to her grandfather, asking if anything strange happened to him while clearing, when suddenly Minchul folded his arms over his chest, answering that it was only a level 10 monster, so no. He suddenly added that he didn't say that it could be a distortion, to which Jimin replied that it was hard not to admit it, but it was, since it hadn't happened since the Berserker appeared, when Kalia suddenly asked what would happen if the same thing happened to the other dungeons. The girl thoughtfully raised her head, saying that although this chance was low, it still couldn't be ignored. She looked at them, adding that they needed to gather more information, and she would ask the head of the association to remeasure all the low-ranking dungeons. The girl's mouth fell open in surprise, asking if these were dungeon gates, to which the guy replied that it was rare, but he had seen quite a few cases where 2 dungeons were connected. They came closer, looking around. Without taking their eyes off him, the guy added that this was the first time he saw 3 dungeons in one place. The next day, a man with an axe on his shoulder scratched his head in confusion and asked if this was really his armor, adding that he seemed to have gotten it wrong. In another place, another man scratched his ear and said that he didn't even know why he was wrong everywhere. And in another place, an old man waved his hand at the protagonist with his uncle's hand and said that he didn't know this wasn't his dungeon. That same day, the house shook from Mankal's furious scream. He waved his fists and shouted that wherever they went, they were everywhere, had even the inspectors become bribable, and the protagonist looked at the results, in which he had cleared 5 dungeons today, and Seoyun 26, and said that he was glad the previous method did not work. They found another way to stop them. Seoyun also could not hold back and, raising her fist, furiously shouted that this would not work anymore, so she would rebel even if she had to use her grandfather's name. After a while, a letter was ready, inside which was that if another participant made an unauthorized raid in a reserved dungeon, then at the discretion of the inspector, the owner of the reservation could be credited with points as compensation. The protagonist looked at his phone and thought that the pass could not be returned, but there were still a couple of days left until the end of the competition. Driving in the car, he wanted to say that now everything would go smoothly, but did not have time as they stopped abruptly. A car stopped in front of them, the owner of which apologized for the fact that his car was accidentally. There were many cars on the road, and almost everyone interfered with the main character, asking what he should do because he stopped abruptly where his keys were. At the end of the day, Xiaojun cleared 21 dungeons and Soyun 24, thanks to which she overtook the guy. At home, Soyun approached the guys and said that they all insisted that they had nothing to do with Soyun, but the head of the dungeon management promised to deal with this matter directly, to which Manchel shouted that by then it would be too late. Then the girl pointed her finger and replied that she recently found out that Soyun's father Seokman is the director of the academy she goes to. Hearing this, the uncle angrily looked at Soyun and asked, "Seokman?" Raising her hand, the girl explained that he was a former A-level hunter, one of the few people her grandfather had acknowledged, to which Manchel asked in surprise if he was really a professional hunter acknowledged by the Star Sword himself. Was he really that strong? No, but he was a gifted talker, so he had connections everywhere, Saiyan replied, to which Manchel sighed in displeasure and said that he was not even surprised. The girl's voice could be heard in the bright room, saying that that was why she was afraid that they would not be able to conduct an investigation. Even if his involvement in the case was found out, it would be too late, although if the grandfather intervened, everything would be smoothed out quickly, to which the protagonist said that he did not think the Star Sword would agree to this, after which Saiyan replied in disappointment that she thought so too, but now she could not even contact him. Then the uncle asked what they should do, because they could not just give up the victory, after which the three sat in silence. After a while, Seiyun lowered her head and apologized to Xiaojun for not being able to help him. Hearing this, the guy was very confused and with a very sad face said that she had helped them all this time, supported them and stood up for them, and if it weren't for her, everything would have been much worse. Manchel folded his arms and said that the guy was right, because she did everything she could, the rest was up to them. Suddenly, he pointed at the main character and exclaimed, or rather from this kid, adding that he should lay out what was on his mind, because he was sure that he had already come up with something. Xiaojun suddenly smiled widely. The next day, the director slammed his fist on the table with all his might and shouted that they were overtaken again, but how could this happen? The subordinate stood not far in front of him and answered that he thought that he only booked a dungeon when he was already near it, so it was impossible to predict where he would go next, to which Seokman shouted that they should stop him by all means. At this time, the protagonist ran out of the portal and his uncle shouted that it was time to go further, and the director shouted in shock, asking if it really took him only 5 minutes to book and clear the dungeons, ordering after that to bribe the inspectors, because they were ready to do anything for money. But now it was not the inspectors who stood at the portals, but the people from the dungeon management, because the academy had complained about them. When the director was informed about this, he jumped up from his chair and asked if the governing council had really come only because of the academy's complaint. What kind of academy was this? Who was this hunter? To which the guy replied that he could be wrong, but there were rumors that the academy was founded by the granddaughter of the Star Sword. Hearing this, Seokman introduced the old man and froze in shock. After a short pause, he shouted throughout the building for his subordinate to find another way, because this time their academy would definitely win, and if they lost, he should be prepared for the consequences. Son killed monsters and the protagonist did the same. They overtook each other time after time, and in the end, they both cleared 141 dungeons. The highest committee gathered in the competition organizer's office. The girl shouted at the guy in rage, asking how a participant who committed various types of cheating could win, to which the guy shouted back for her to watch her language, saying that they were the ones who caused the accident. While they continued to quarrel, the third man suddenly jumped up from his seat and ordered everyone to calm down. The man looked at the girl, saying that the committee had come to the conclusion that there could be no draws. Looking at the sarcastic Seokman, he added that since there was no hard evidence that Seo Yeon had cheated, disqualification was impossible, so there was one suggestion. Yeon Seok looked ahead, seeing that the guys had arrived. In front of him, he saw member Seojun. He then looked to the side, noticing Seo Yeon next to him. The leader smiled, saying that since they had come, he would explain how the final round would proceed, after which the winner would be determined. The members approached him with interest. Yeon Seok raised his hand, saying that the rules were simple since the guys could choose one of 3 dungeons, and proceed to the second one after completing the raid of the first one. He smiled, saying that the one who cleared 2 dungeons wins, when suddenly the protagonist inquired, asking what the point of raiding the second dungeon was, if, in fact, the one who completed the first one faster wins. The leader lowered his head, saying that they wanted to do that at first, but they couldn't find a suitable place where 2 dungeons were connected, so they chose this one since he couldn't leave those dungeons unattended. Scratching his head, he asked if the winner should have more dungeons cleared than the second place, when he suddenly added that all 3 dungeons have 2 difficulty stars, but there is no difference between them, so the participants can discuss which dungeon they want to go to among themselves. Seojun turned his gaze to Soyeon, thinking that it was unlikely that she had set something up this time either. Without taking his eyes off her, He asked if he could choose first, to which she sighed, allowing him to do as he wished. He pointed his spear forward, saying that he would go to the right, after which Soyeon immediately replied that she would go to the left. The participants approached the gate. Finally, the girl turned to the guy, asking him not to cry later. The protagonist turned to her in confusion when suddenly Yeonseok raised his hand up, asking them to get ready. He suddenly waved his hand, ordering the participants to begin. Seojin confidently ran inside. Frowning, he wondered what the girl meant. The guy sped up, thinking that he didn't care because now winning was much more important. The protagonist looked around warily, thinking that there would be ordinary kobolds here, but not to mention them, he didn't even hear a single sigh, wondering if it was something else. Walking further, he thought that it was somehow strange, because 5 minutes had already passed, but he hadn't encountered anyone. In horror, he suddenly stopped abruptly, gritting his teeth from a terrible scream. The guy noticed the paw of a monster, thinking that it was definitely not a kobold. The monster immediately appeared, jumping forward when Seojin suddenly recognized it as a manticore. The guy looked up at the approaching monster, confusedly wondering what a level 4 monster was doing here. He frowned, wondering if there was a mistake in measuring the dungeon. The protagonist clenched his teeth in anger. Enveloped in mana, he swung at the monster with all his might. Having lost its head, the manticore fell to the floor, bleeding. Seojin quickly ran forward, thinking that although he dealt with the manticore quickly, it took a very long time. He approached the gate, tensely thinking that Soyeon had most likely already completed the raid. He jumped out when suddenly the leader called out to him. The guy was very angry, shouting loudly that there was a manticore in the dungeon. Yeonseok asked in confusion if the manticore was really a level 4 manticore, to which the protagonist shouted that the man could see for himself, after which Yeonseok asked in disbelief if the contestant had really defeated the monster on his own. Seojin angrily shouted that it was unfair, so he was demanding a rematch, to which the man put his hand to his chin, replying that he completely understood this request. He closed his eyes, adding that it would be difficult to cancel the competition right now since Soyeon had not come out yet. The protagonist's expression suddenly changed. He was so shocked that he could not utter a word. The boy turned to the gate, saying that it was strange. He took a step forward, saying if there really were kobolds inside. The girl looked around, while Seojin added, asking what the girl was doing inside for 10 minutes. In the past, the boy's wound on his cheek was smeared with cream. He sat on the floor and said that their Soyeon's hands were simply ruthless, then asked if she would really go over to the side of the monsters when she became a professional hunter. To which the girl replied with displeasure that he should stop talking nonsense, then asked why he listened to his father. Hearing the boy answer that you can't deceive people for your own benefit, he does not want that even if he has to go against his father's words, the girl looked at him sadly. The guy closed his eyes and added that if Soyeon was a professional hunter, there must be something in her heart that she should never compromise on, to which the girl exclaimed, "Here we go again." She clenched her fists and screamed furiously, which was no longer funny, then asked if he knew that people called him a reckless fool and what if it made things worse. Because in this world, all the problems are only from kindness, so he should not jump over his head when he can't even take care of himself. She continued to scream and ask for something that cannot be compromised. The guy looked at her with a smile on his face while she screamed for him to wake up, because now is the age of professional hunters. The era of heroes has passed, or they are completely dead, like that. There are no more in this world. But when the guy said there are, Soyeon stopped in surprise. He put his hands on his feet and added that there are as many of them as there are honest and incorruptible politicians. It was very dark outside, and the girl said discontentedly that talking to him was comparable to a dialogue with a stone. After a while, Soyeon was running in the heavy rain. She ran between people, asking to let her pass. When she stopped, tears flowed from her eyes. She stood in front of a dead body that the medics were going to move and said to herself that her brother was the most reckless fool in this world. Later, in her father's office, the director said that he knew that his son was stupid, but to protect some stranger, after which he asked if Soyeon would disappoint him. The girl silently stood opposite and said to herself that her brother died trying to help others, not knowing his place. Looking at her father, she firmly answered, yes, adding in her head that she was not like her brother, and when will she not live like him? At the moment, she was walking through the dungeon. She looked around and asked herself why no one was coming out. The protagonist stood outside and asked in surprise if she hadn't come out yet. The inspector raised his hand and replied, yes, the participant Soyeon was still inside the dungeon, so the guy won even under these circumstances, but he had one dungeon left, and the prize was his. Seojin looked at the man in surprise and said to himself that this was strange, something clearly didn't add up here. He remembered the huge manticore and said to himself that he was sure that the dungeon measurement error was not just an accident, but another trick from Soyeon. But then why? When suddenly the second inspector with the device in his hand suddenly shouted, why all of a sudden? The first inspector looked at his colleague and asked what happened, to which he replied that the mana meter was acting strangely. It only showed 3 stars and then suddenly 4. The protagonist suddenly sank into memories, remembering how he asked the Star Sword what the distortion of the dungeon meant and what the distortion of magic meant, to which the old man told everything in detail. The boy's eyes showed horror as the inspectors talked among themselves that it seemed like the device had broken. One of them put his hand to his chin and said that just in case, he thought they should call professional hunters to investigate. Turning to the protagonist, he said that they had found a mistake, so he would continue the competition later, but before he could finish speaking, he did not find Sajun. There were only him and his colleague on the field. At this time, in the red portal, blood spurted from the girl's mouth. Soyeon, with her arm torn off, was sitting on the floor. She was eclipsed by the huge shadow of the monster. In front of her stood the 6-star monster Nerkura. Suddenly, it raised its head and roared furiously. The girl grinned in confusion, saying that this could not be. She knew that there was no justice in the world when suddenly the monster pushed off the ground. It quickly approached the girl, who was lying on the ground in fear. Soyeon closed her eyes, saying that she would not die such a stupid death like her brother. The monster opened its mouth wide, growling loudly. After a few seconds, the girl suddenly opened her eyes in shock. She looked up, noticing a silhouette. The protagonist was protecting the girl, blocking the monster's attack. The guy, trembling in his body, asked if the girl could move. Soyeon frowned, when suddenly he added that she needed to quickly get out of here since time was running out. Using all his strength, Sajun clenched his teeth. Soyeon gathered her strength, shouting loudly, "What is the protagonist doing here?" The guy jumped, thinking that a 6-star monster should be attacked only with his feet. He soared into the air, menacingly calling out to the monster. With glowing eyes, he shouted loudly when suddenly Sajun thought that he had succeeded because the monster switched to him. Nerkura suddenly swung his paw hard. He menacingly tried to attack the protagonist. Sajun blocked the attacks, thinking that he was one move away from being a dead man. He jumped to the side, thinking that the monster's movements were somewhat familiar to him, and if he continued to deal damage like this, Nerkura did not take his eyes off the protagonist. He tilted his head and then pierced the guy's shoulder with his horn. Seojin immediately felt hot and could not make a sound. The monster swung its head, throwing the guy far away. Bleeding, the participant landed next to Seoyeon. The protagonist gritted his teeth, trying to get up. Nerkura opened his mouth wide, screaming loudly. Seoyeon tried to catch his breath, saying that the monster was more agile than he thought, so it seemed like the fight would not end soon, and then asked if it was difficult for the girl to move. Seoyeon held his hand, asking why the guy was doing this. She did not take her eyes off him, loudly screaming why Seojun came to save her. What benefit did he have from this? She squeezed his hand, saying that it was none of the protagonist's business. Couldn't he just clear the last dungeon and win? Soyeon screamed, asking if she was wrong. Seojun came here for the money, to which the protagonist smiled maliciously, saying that she was right, he came for the big money. The girl looked at his back, ordering him to go away and win, since he knew about everything she had done, or did the guy think that she would thank him for saving him? She added menacingly for the guy to forget about it, to which the protagonist frowned, saying no. The girl was shocked, when suddenly Seojun said that her actions were wrong, so he had no desire to forgive her for it. Without turning around, he added that he did not think that this was the reason why Soyeon should die. The girl put her hand on the ground in fear as she heard Seojun say that it was hard to believe, but there would definitely come a day when they could meet again. The protagonist continued to say that he also didn't think that was a reason why he shouldn't help her. Seojun started to remember the past when the guy said that he was a person who didn't care about any benefits, and he acted without thinking, all for that. The protagonist turned around, having finished becoming her hero, when he suddenly frowned, shouting loudly that there was no reward in the world more valuable than saving a person. The monster was enveloped in mana, then opened its mouth wide. With wild eyes, it released its claws, heading forward. Seojun grabbed the spear, shouting that he had squeezed it. The monster howled. It rushed straight at the hero. The youth opened his eyes wide. It looked at its opponent. Suddenly, an image of Chiron popped into his head, saying that intuition is part of the mind. But most students don't quite understand the meaning of these words. Their essence is that part of the mind means assessing what is happening. The guy remembered watching this lecture, recalling the words that if you just assess the situation, then there will be no time to make a decision, but most of their students perceived this incorrectly and decided to abandon assessment and thinking. Chiron stomped, asking if this was what he was talking about at the very beginning. The hero was struck by lightning when he remembered the lecturer's words that intuition is part of the mind and you need to connect the mind with feelings. Sajun's eyes lit up blue. The monster was already close. The guy looked at it. At the last moment, he dodged the attack of the monster's paw. The same one simply hit the ground. There was a small wound on the hero's face, but he began to see. He blocked the enemy's attack because he saw all of his attacks. Looking at him, he realized that he could see every muscle. The young man dodged another attack with a jump. While in the air, he realized that at this rate he could hold out until the professional hunters arrived, because the inspector had most likely already called them. Below him lay a girl without an arm. Looking at her, he did not know how long she could hold out. Leaning against the wall, the guy realized that there was no time to do nothing. He jumped away from the wall. He lunged, because he had the power to tear mountains out of the ground and a spirit capable of turning the whole world upside down. He was heading straight for the open mouth of the monster. The protagonist's face was calm. Already flying up to the monster, he instinctively felt that the beast would not win. He gripped the spear tighter. With his eyes wide open, he decided to use the aura with the spear. The hero screamed as he flew up to the monster. The girl looked with her eyes wide open. A guy was standing in front of her. The monster was defeated with one blow, but Soyeon could not believe it. The young man stood leaning on a spear. Taking the girl by the arm, he said that he would die of embarrassment, helping her, asking if she was dead at all because his efforts were not in vain. She, holding the guy's hand, answered that she was not dead. Standing in front of her, the guy added that they did not have time and needed to leave quickly. The weather was clear. The man asked them where they had gone and suddenly shouted, asking if they were okay and what had happened inside. Seojin replied that he would explain everything later, but now they needed to call an ambulance because someone was unwell here. The man stood with his back to them and shouted for someone to call an ambulance quickly because they had an emergency. The guy looked at the girl when she said that she did not consider him her benefactor. He sat next to her when she said that she still thought that he had made a mistake. The young man replied that she should think as she wanted because he did not want to save her. The field where they were sitting was visible. Someone was shouting about how this could have happened because they urgently needed to go to the hospital. Seo-yoon was carried away on a stretcher, and as soon as the news about the dungeon clearing competition came out, society stood on its ears. That same monster that appeared in the Z-level dungeon. The guy understood that this was not a measurement error because there had not yet been a single case where the difference in levels was so big. People discussed this news, not understanding what kind of guy this Seo-jun was, but also all the attention was riveted to them, not only by ordinary people, but also by the association and the government. In people's phones, there was information about an ordinary student who went against Nerkura. A man in a robe stood in front of Kalia, saying that the apostle of abstinence was waiting for him, but the young man did not understand. He looked at the man as he added that it was probably about the distortions that had appeared in Korea. Jimin pointed at the phone, screaming that this was the man who had dealt with the distorted monster from Seiyan Academy. Grandpa, standing in front of her, answered in the affirmative, calling the guy an ugly dwarf. The hero was lying on his hands, upset about the money. The man sitting next to him asked if that was all he cared about, to which the boy exclaimed that yes, since he had won. Looking at the man, he continued to scream about how they had made a draw and whether they had gone too far by dividing the prize in half. He pointed upwards, saying that they couldn't even split the prize with rock, paper, scissors, or even mukshapa, and the man replied that she had lost her arm. Frowning, the boy said that he had counted on it. Manchel asked if he had really lost his humanity because of his obsession with money. Seiyan entered the room while the boy was talking about trying Aniki Baniki. The man did not understand why he had saved her then. The hero grabbed his head and screamed because he himself did not know why he had saved her. The girl could not understand what was wrong with him, and the man replied that she should not worry about it because he was crying because of a tie. She, looking at them, asked why the protagonist thought that they had split the money because he was the winner. With wide eyes, he explained that Soyeon had personally refused her winnings, and she had also revealed all the machinations that had been carried out during the competition. She was also in the next room, and the girl continued to tell him that she had also accused her father of this. The boy had a surprised expression, remembering her words about him making a mistake, not understanding why she suddenly did that. Also standing in front of them, Si-yoon explained that she came for something else, namely to convey So-yeon's words. Remembering the meeting with her, she repeated her words that she still thought that So-jun did wrong. She looked at Si-yoon, also adding that she thought that it was her mistake too. The hero's eyes widened, while the girl in the room added that she still didn't understand what she was talking about. Putting her hands on her hips, she also said that the protagonist would take the prize anyway, and besides, the government would take responsibility for what happened, and offered him benefits. Raising a finger, she began by saying that the couple would be exempt from taxes on the prize money and 100 million won as a bonus. With wide eyes, he exclaimed at the amount, while the girl replied that it was not a bonus at all, but something like compensation for damages. The boy raised his fingers and counted his winnings, and Si-yoon added that there was one more thing. She smiled widely, saying that their academy had finally been promoted to 3rd class. The hero also smiled, while the girl explained that it was thanks to his winnings, because now they met the evaluation criteria, and also added that they now had access to some privileges. And what was most important for the protagonist was that they could clear 4th level dungeons. While the boy thought about how he had been worried about being promoted to 3rd class and the money during the previous competitions. Looking at Si-yoon, he said that they were really lucky, to which she replied that it was all thanks to him. Seojin smiled widely, saying that she would now be able to slowly recruit students. Crossing his arms over his chest, Manchul noted that things had gone uphill, and the boy replied that now he wouldn't have to play with So-yeon for the winnings. The hospital building was visible. The hero offered them something to eat, offering to buy whatever they wanted. The man noted that as soon as the guy had money, he immediately gained humanity, adding that he wanted something more expensive. The girl said that she wanted sushi. He picked up the phone. He looked at it, realizing that the time had come, scrolling through the transcendental store, knowing that the time for shopping had come. The hero, looking at the phone in surprise, exclaimed that the price had increased to 400 million won. He looked at the Longinus spear, saying that only recently it cost only 100 million, and the problem was that he did not know how the cost calculation works, because it is unclear how to wait for the moment when the price will be the most profitable. The protagonist, frowning, thought that if the price continues to rise, then he will not only save, but also lose a lot of money. Scrolling through the store, he decided to buy another weapon. He looked at all the things on offer and concluded that the spear would be the best choice, not knowing whether he should buy it. Suddenly, flashbacks of the unsuccessful chance of buying popped up in his head, although he knew that the goods looked good. But that was always the case in the photo and he shouldn't buy blindly. Even though the price was quite low, also not understanding why goods that deserved a price of tens of billions were only priced at 100 to 200 million won. Even if it was a replica, how could it be that price? Putting his hand to his chin, he wondered if it was possible that such a tasty price was just a lure for inattentive students who would want to buy it at one price and then, without looking at the changes, poke at a higher price after the adjustment, but did not have time to cancel, concluding that it sounded rather implausible because there was no need for anyone to do such a thing. Looking at many things, he did not understand why the store did not write in detail about the product. Because of this, you have to guess what advantages or disadvantages the product has based on a short description. Crossing his arms, he said that it was like buying a pig in a poke. It is also unclear whether it is worth it or not, because checking assumptions about the product cannot be possible, because he will only be able to find out about it after the purchase. Suddenly looking to the side, he assumed that there may be customer reviews in the community. He opened the discussions on his phone, also remembering that for some reason that he had long forgotten. He did not have an ID, so the hero cannot write posts in the community or comment on them, but he still has the ability to view them, not understanding why he did not start creating an ID earlier. Suddenly he saw posts about the products. Reading the information on the phone, he exclaimed that someone really bought 100 pieces of different weapons. A guy with a shield appeared on the screen. It was written that this thing is absolutely useless. The guy, squinting, continued to read about the ability of the shield, which can turn anyone who looks at it into stone, but the owner is not immune to this either. He lay down more comfortably, saying that someone really bought so many weapons, judging by such a long list. His eyes widened. He saw about kibises. This is an ordinary bag for carrying light things, but this is only at first glance. A little lower it was written that in fact this bag has spatial magic, helping to expand space to a fairly large size. It also has time-stopping magic and lightning. He saw images of this bag, reading that such goods are better bought as a replica and not expensive originals, which do not justify even the slightest bit of their price. Also a little lower it was written about the disadvantages, because since this is a replica, it does not reduce the weight completely like the original, but only by 70%, and the internal size is not infinite, but quite large. Getting out of bed, he saw a score of 100 out of 10 because he really recommended buying it. Looking at his phone, he remembered that a bag with such a name was owned by the god Hera from Greek mythology, after which she gave it to the hero Perseus, who killed Medusa with it. He started looking for it in the store to find out the cost. He saw the price of 100 million, surprised that it was very small. The guy put his hand on the back of his head, saying that considering all this, such a bag would be quite a useful thing, although it was a little pity that it would not be able to completely reduce the weight. Suddenly, he froze. Opening his mouth wide, he realized that it would be very useful anyway without completely reducing the weight. It was already night over the hospital. He decided that he had to buy it. 3 days later, the hero was already holding this spear in his hands, saying that it looked simply magnificent in real life. Taking the bag in his hands, he also added that, as with the kibises, it would be necessary to test its effectiveness, although he already felt an unusual aura emanating from it. The guy began to cry, because now his savings book was empty again, saying that he had no idea that this bag would change the prices so much when purchased, because apparently the store really was cheating. Putting his hand on his belt, he thought that in any case, he bought what he wanted and most importantly, that it justified the money invested. Saiyan came up to him from behind, asking if he was really going to the dungeon again, because not much time had passed since the last one and he should rest. The hero replied that he was completely fine, because he could not relax, knowing that he needed to earn more money. They stood opposite each other. She noted that he had only recently received the cash prize, to which he replied that he had already spent it. The girl looked at the guy and exclaimed that he really managed to spend 400 million won. The protagonist handed her the spear. The boy beamed when she told him that he still decided to buy it despite complaining about his empty pockets. The roofs of the buildings were visible. She said that it was his personal money anyway and she would not say anything about it. A torch was visible. They entered a 4-star dungeon. The hero told her to stick to him, because if it suddenly became dangerous, it would be easier for him to protect both of them. Gargoyles stood in front of them. One of them opened her mouth wide. Lowering the spear, the guy thought that since this was a dungeon of such difficulty, the monsters here should have the highest defense rank. He rushed at them, thinking that in this case, the monsters would be perfect for testing the spear. Swinging it, he decided to use it without magic first and see how much damage it would do. The gargoyle's eyes glowed red, and the boy understood that his weapon had to do at least some damage, and then, if it suddenly became dangerous, he would put magic. He struck one of them. It flew into 2 pieces. The hero looked at it, perplexed. Pointing his finger at the monster, he asked the girl what it was. She, wide-eyed, did not understand why he was asking her. They were still looking at the monster. Smiling, Seiyan realized that even now, after all his improvements, he was able to surprise her. The boy chopped gargoyle after gargoyle. He continued to kill monsters, but the girl did not understand why they were cut as easily as tofu, because in their days they really consisted of beans. The hero took out a bag, saying that not much had accumulated, but it was worth trying to collect them. She looked at the boy, thinking that such a small bag could hold very little. Getting up from the ground, he noted that although it reduced everything by 70%, it still felt heavy. He began to pour the gargoyles out of the bag, saying that he would use it at the end of the raid. The girl, looking at him, asked about the prize, because it really wasn't 400 million won, but dollars, to which the guy answered negatively. Raising her hand, she asked how he bought all this then. The guy, looking at her, answered that he bought it in a hunter's shop, which he accidentally ended up in, and the girl exclaimed where such a shop was. The young man, coming closer, explained that this shop was located in a dark alley next to his house and was intended for academy students. The girl exclaimed again that it was really possible to buy such cool spears and bags there for only 400 million, asked to show where it was. The girl smiled widely while the hero answered her that she would not be able to go there, because the last time he went there, the owner said that he was planning to close the store and go on a trip. He was all aglow, realizing that he was lying. They walked on. The girl said that if Xiaojun said so, then she would believe him. There were flags hanging on the walls. The corridor was endless. Suddenly, something fell. They heard it. There were many gargoyles in front of them. The guy said that it would be very dangerous here. The girl, taking the hilt of the sword, answered that she would take care of them herself, but the guy asked her to stop. Looking at Xiaojun, he asked her to let him kill them himself because he just wanted to try something. Holding the spear in his hands, he realized that the spear was actually many times stronger than he expected. Remembering how he cut the gargoyle, he realized that he did not even put magic then. Taking a stance, he decided to try putting magic into it. His spear was covered in a blue glow. Remembering all his past battles, he lowered his head. Opening his eyes wide, he thought of complete destruction. His spear was being filled with energy. The girl's mouth opened wide. She looked at his spear, not understanding what kind of terrifying power it was. The gargoyles threw themselves at him. They attacked him from above. The guy raised his head and looked up. He released all the accumulated energy in the spear. The spear took on its normal appearance. He still stood, holding it in his hands. Seiyan's eyes opened wide, not understanding what happened. There was a huge hole in front of the hero. This spear, which according to myths pierced Jesus hanging on the cross, the young man thought that even despite the history behind this weapon, he thought that it would be a so-so weapon, hoping that it would at least work a little. Remembering what he did in the dungeon, he said that he had not made a mistake with his choice and apparently his eye was trained in some sense. He looked at the phone, also realizing that he had not made a mistake with his choice of kibises, which also pleased him, deciding to rely on student reviews in the future and also to buy more weapons, saying that the more goods he bought, the cheaper he would be able to buy weapons later. Clenching his fists, he realized that he needed to watch as many lectures as possible. The girl, looking at the young man, said that she wanted to tell him something. The guy stopped during a squat when she said that Jimin's sister wanted to see him, asking if he minded. The hall was visible. He replied that he did not know such a person, to which she replied that she did not even know how to describe her. Raising a finger, she added that he would probably understand better if she told him that she was a student of a person who was given the nickname Devil. The hero remembered who they were talking about, because in that case, Jimin was the same girl who no one could compare to except the devil himself. Pointing his finger at himself, he thought about whether this was the same one who was awarded the title of the devil's successor, asking why she wanted to see him. To which Saeon replied that she just wanted to ask about the penultimate conquest of the dungeon, which thundered throughout Korea. The guy looked away, thinking that since she knew about the last case, it means she was interested in how he dealt with the monster then. The girl added that if he did not want to, he could refuse, because she would not allow his sister to press him too much and could easily refuse, citing the fact that the young man was not feeling well. He remembered how the Star Sword pressed him, asking that she would really behave like him, to which the girl replied that her sister was not even close. He put his hand on his waist and replied that he didn't mind in that case. She said that she would text her now, and as soon as she told him the time and date, she would let him know. She typed a message on her phone. Smiling, the girl sent it. Suddenly, Jimin appeared behind her, Saeon exclaimed in surprise. His sister took off her glasses while Saeon was talking about whether she really planned to come here anyway regardless of the answer, to which she replied that she foresaw that he would not refuse. Smiling, she asked where the guy that grandfather praised so much was. With wide eyes, she shouted that this could not be. She looked at the hero, not believing that this person could be a high school student. Frowning, she exclaimed about where he could get such a thing. Pointing her finger at him, she interrupted him, asking where he got it. The boy looked at her, saying that he would be glad to answer, but could she clarify what the object was? She answered that he knew everything and was just pretending to be a fool. Seo Yoon grabbed her sister, asking her to calm down. Because Seo Jun really didn't understand what she was talking about, Jimin screamed at her to let her go because she had to find out where he got it. The protagonist watched this with wide eyes. Jimin sat on a chair, while the girl apologized to the guy for her inappropriate behavior, because she usually doesn't behave like that, it's just that when she's interested in something, she starts pushing like a tank until she finds out the answer to the question. The guy couldn't believe that this was the one she was talking about. His eyes turned white when Seo Yoon explained that everything was correct and it was her. Looking at her, he asked why she looked so young then, since from what he heard, she was already well over 40 years old. The girl answered that she really was that old, she just applied some kind of magic to her appearance to look young. The guy looked at Saeon, asking if that was really possible, but Jimin had already answered, saying that thanks to the imprinting magic, she can constantly maintain the appearance of her body when she was young based on the memories she has, adding that it seems quite easy from the outside. Raising her hand, she also said that it was actually quite difficult for her to master this magic. Pointing her finger, she shouted for him to now answer her question about where he got this magic bag. The hero did not understand what she was talking about. Taking it in his hands, he asked if she was talking about it. She answered in the affirmative, asking how he was able to create such a miracle, also asking if he knew how big the space was there. Looking at Saeon, he asked what else her sister had managed to tell her, to which she replied that she hadn't told her anything at all, because as soon as she arrived she had immediately run inside, and before that they hadn't written to each other that often, adding that she was absolutely delighted with the bag. Her eyes widened even more when the hero told her that there was nothing in it that could delight her, but she cried out that this was the best thing that many people could only dream of. The guy tilted his head, listening to the fact that 4 magics were simultaneously activated in this tiny bag, namely, such as expanding space, reducing weight, cloning samples, and magic that she couldn't even recognize, asking what this miracle bag was made of, since it was able to withstand 4 different types of magic. The guy thought about how much she chatted because his ears were already withering. The girl's scream rang out throughout the room asking him to sell her the bag, but he replied that it would be quite difficult to do so. The guy's eyes widened when he heard the girl say that she was offering 1 billion won. Looking at her, he asked if the price was high and where she would get that kind of money, to which Jimin replied that considering the value of the bag, it was worth it and, moreover, she would be giving it away in parts, so finding that amount would not be a problem, especially since she had offered an even lower price since if you buy it in a store, you could pay several times more. The guy lowered his head while she was telling him to agree faster since it was not every day that you would have the opportunity to pay that kind of money. After all, he understood that he had only bought the bag for 300 million won, while the original one had been sold for less than 1 billion won. Looking at her, he thought that he was not Mother Teresa to tell her the truth, especially since she was a person who had money, and he did not think that Jimin would become poor, and also 1 billion won was an amount that would help solve the problems with paying off the kibises and several lectures. Looking at the phone, he replied that the bag was not for sale. Saeon could not understand why, because the guy had problems with money. Jimin could not believe it. The guy sadly lowered his head, and she continued to shout that 1 billion was really not enough, because it seemed to her that this was a more than favorable price. Handing her the bag, he said that she should try to use it in practice and then she would understand why it was said that way. The bag struck her like lightning. It fell to the floor. Taking his hand, she could not understand why this was so. The hero replied that no one except him could use it. Holding the bag in his hands, he explained that she would not be able to touch it, so he was completely silent about resale. The girl's eyes were shining. She exclaimed that it really had not 4, but 5 spells cast on it, asking him where he managed to buy it. The academy building was visible, and the girl continued to shout that the hero should give her information and then she would pay 10 billion. The girl, squinting, said that the guy was leading to the fact that the store was near his house, but by a magical coincidence. He did not remember who sold it, and the store disappeared after your purchase, adding that she was sad to hear this, but apparently it was not meant to be. Putting her hands on her belt, she asked the hero to help her in one matter. He looked at her while she was talking about how since she couldn't use the pouch herself, he would help her by participating in her plan, assuring her that there was nothing illegal about it, and immediately added that she would also pay for the service, but the guy didn't understand that she, unable to buy or simply use it, decided to resort to help. Putting his hand to his face, he thought that most likely if he helped himself, then nothing bad would happen, not understanding why she needed his help so much. Rubbing his chin, he explained that he was worthy of agreeing if she paid him. Extending his hand, the hero also added that he was quite busy, so he asked in advance whether she wanted to start right now or later. Jimin answered that later and she would tell him the date and time in advance, and after that they would go to the lab together and it wouldn't take much time. The young man smiled when the girl said that she wanted to find out something else. He didn't ask about the second to last conquered dungeon, she said. Crossing her arms, she answered affirmatively, asking for more details. Sitting in front of him, she summed up by saying that Mercura ended up in the dungeon, but the magic cast there couldn't detect him, to which the guy answered affirmatively. Taking a glass in her hand, she asked how he managed to defeat such a monster, to which the young man answered that he was lucky. She answered that he was really lucky to defeat a 5-star monster only thanks to luck, because even a high-class pro got a lot of damage when fighting him and ran away, to which the guy answered that there was something else besides luck. Remembering the battle with the monster, he realized that the monster was only unstable to the magic used by the hero and wondered if Merlin's lecture could really be applied in their world. Raising his hand, he asked if he could express one theory that was firmly entrenched in his head, to which she responded approvingly. Looking at Jimin, he explained that as everyone knows, magic and aura are directly dependent on mana. In other words, he wants to touch on the topic of how mana is used and how it comes into contact with their world, although it sounds absurd. The girl's eyes widened from the guy's words that the deformation of the dungeons could somehow be related to mana. Jumping up, she asked him to tell her more, and the guy replied that if we assume that magic and aura do have the property of being distorted when used, then is it possible that the deformations of the dungeon are connected to these distortions? Holding his hand, he remembered Merlin's words about how after using this or that magic, one can even distort the space of their world, saying that then the assumption that the deformation of the dungeons is caused by someone's will from the outside can work, realizing that the deformation in the dungeons is not a natural phenomenon, which can only mean that the result of this can be interference from the outside. The guy rolled his eyes, thinking that he raised a very stupid topic in front of such a genius magician, because now she can just laugh at the hero. Throwing his hand behind his head, he said that it was just a theory and it sounded absurd, so there was no need to dwell on it. The girl, getting up from her chair, asked the young man if he was a mage. He dropped his hands and replied that he was just a novice monster hunter who dreamed of becoming a pro, but the girl screamed that how could he have come up with such a theory then, since he apparently did not want to tell how he came to this, adding that one could not come up with such a theory without having a good command of magic, while the guy understood that it was not he who came up with it, but Merlin. The girl grabbed her head, talking about the magic bag. The protagonist opened his eyes wide. Pointing her finger at him, she asked if he had made this bag himself. Looking at him, she also asked about what he had decided to do, rather than simply not attract attention to himself as a brilliant mage, so he decided to hide behind the title of a novice monster hunter. The hero opened his mouth wide, not understanding what she was talking about and how this conversation could have gone in such a direction. The girl was all shining, asking how he came up with this. Closing his eyes, he explained to her. The basis of his explanation was the knowledge he received from Merlina, and he supplemented it with his own thoughts, not thinking that it would cause such a violent reaction. The girl continued to shine, asking another question about whether this is related to the origins of mana and aura. The guy, raising his hands, told her about everything, knowing that this was said in the lectures, because their courses take knowledge and thinking beyond the human. He also understood that he was just an ordinary student dreaming of becoming a professional who did not know anything about magical sciences at all. And could this superficial knowledge really be enough? In such an environment, he felt like a teacher. Suddenly, he fell silent, thinking that knowledge can be considered a commodity and you can simply charge people for training. She continued to write down every word the young man said. Folding his hands on the table, he thought that this wisdom that he had learned through his own efforts, unlike the equipment from the store, therefore made sense to apply it in another field, realizing that he should not just retell the lecture materials, but be able to present it in his own interpretation. The girl put her hand to her face, while the guy was still wondering who would want to study with the same student. Exhaling, she noted that the hero was not at all familiar with the concepts of magical teachings, while the guy understood that this was all because of his course, studied at 18%. Getting up from the table, she said that she was very surprised by his words at the beginning, which she did not expect from Sajin at all, but therefore she will definitely study them. Sayan, entering the room, said that she brought a snack, asking if her sister was already leaving, to which she replied that the business was finished and it was time to know the end. The girl stood with a bag in her hands, while she reminded him that she would invite the hero to the research center later, and Sayan added that it would be better for Jimin to eat before leaving. Remembering her image, the guy noted that she was very unusual and different from her image dictated by the media, to which Sayan replied that she often hears such things and sometimes even she begins to doubt that she is the next devil. The hero understood that such people as the Star Sword, Kalia, and now the Devil's Disciple are almost impossible for an ordinary person to meet in a lifetime, and he met all three. Sayan, sitting down at the table, said that then they will eat it all themselves. The young man thanked her. The guy ate, thinking that at this rate, the great voice could visit him. The hero sat with his eyes closed. Sitting on the floor, he thought that the progress was too slow, because the progress of the courses moved only by fractions of a percent. As he continued to sit, he realized that thanks to the efficiency increase with kibises, he began to deal with individual course assignments faster, but even so, the time was too short to complete them in the allotted time, wanting to complete at least one course before the free admission ended, because the only thing left was to either earn money for free admission or greatly increase the course progress. Opening the door, he turned to Sayan. She was also saying that she did not know what to do. She was thinking about how she could not cope with teaching new students and needed to hire a professor. The guy was still standing in the doorway, trying to call her, and the girl continued to think about the fact that she could not invite just anyone, because she did not know how much to pay and apparently she would have to participate in raids again. The hero came closer and turned to her again. Turning around, she asked him what he wanted. He asked her what she was thinking about since she hadn't heard her name. She replied that she was going to recruit new students, but difficulties arose, so she was no longer sure of her decision. The guy understood that she was having a hard time. Looking at the guy, she asked him what he wanted, to which he replied that he wanted to know if there was any competition coming up soon, like the past academic competitions or the recent dungeon clearing competition. The girl picked up her phone when he asked her to check if there were any in the next 20 days. Looking at the phone, she replied that nothing like that was planned. Looking at the guy, she added that a training exam would be available next month. The guy didn't know what that was. The training exam is only a preliminary stage. But since the main exam for professional is held only once a year, then if you fail, you will have to wait until the next year, and because of this, the pressure on the exam is colossal, so each educational institution has introduced training exams to prepare students in advance. Among them, 3 academies are considered the top 3 in South Korea, namely Huntermill, Isle, and Kaon, and since the training exams from these academies are wide-ranging and allow all students to participate, because it is believed that the earned grades are close to the grades in the professional hunter exam. The hero put his hands on his belt, thinking that all students who are superior to Junwon will participate and give a huge amount as a guarantor, and then the money issue and the problem of course progress will be solved at once. Rubbing his head, he said that nothing can be done about it, realizing that the free use period of the course ends next month, but first of all, it is worth trying. A window was visible. The voice of one of the teachers was heard, who was saying that witchcraft is not perfect, because it can be distorted and misfire at any moment, and under the influence of sudden changes in the situation, witchcraft also changes. The hero watched Chiron's lecture, who was saying that in such moments with misfires, intuition may be needed, because intuition itself can exist as a pattern. Sitting near the bed, the guy said that although he had never thought about it, transcendents are simply amazing. Opening his eyes wider, he heard the teacher's words that the date of the transcendental training exam was approaching, and the only thing he could advise was not to get hung up on grades, because one way or another it was just a preliminary exam. The guy looked at the phone, thinking that he had misheard, because did transcendents really have preliminary training too? A notification about such an exam appeared on the screen. Rubbing his chin, he thought that it really did exist, and apparently, just like in the hunter exam, there are standards and someone evaluates the work. And if you think about it, that advertisement with a 5th rank celestial and a 9th rank sword master is direct proof of that. Remembering that interview, he reasoned that he had taken it for someone's joke. Rubbing his head, he thought that there was no point in taking the transcendental training exam. He pressed his phone, deciding to increase the course progress. A certain man appeared on the screen. He also talked about the training exam and that now the students can freely dispose of enormous power. The guy looked at him in bewilderment, listening to the man's words about how he could repeat it at least 100 times, but they still wouldn't get it, so he needed to sign up and feel on his own skin what kind of worthless students the students were. The exam notification appeared on the screen again. The hero did not understand, because he thought that it was all a recording, but both teachers mentioned the exam on the video, which he did not know when he would watch. With his eyes wide open, the hero thought that in this case the other teachers would also say this. He watched the lecture of Gautama and Merlin, who again mentioned the exam. The hero leaned back on the bed, arguing that there are incredibly many oddities in this academy. Looking at the phone, he did not understand the importance of this exam. Holding the phone in his hands, he decided to look at the community. He saw a post by one of the students who had a very similar situation. He scrolled through the comments, noticing that everyone advised to first raise the level. Suddenly, the guy noticed something. He saw a comment advising to try anyway, because it can help in increasing the progress of the courses, and the hero was interested in this. It was already night and the hero decided to take a risk. Morning came. The young man stood in the training hall. Looking at his phone, he pressed the notification about the exam. Holding the phone in his hands, he saw a new notification that the first participation was free. Continuing to look at the phone, he understood that a free chance should not be wasted, but interrupting himself, he decided that he still had time to earn money, so he decided to start. He accepted the invitation to the exam, quickly chose the direction and category. A notification about the essence of the exam flashed in front of the hero's face, and then his first task began to form. He looked around, not understanding why everything was like this at once and here. With his eyes wide open, he did not understand how the exam was conducted, because it was said that there were only 15 stages, and considering the level of transcendence, even at the first level there could be a monster of 5 or 6 stars, and even if it starts with a 5-star and for each stage, the monster's level increases, then by the last stage a 20-star monster would be waiting for him. The screen showed that the task had been formed. It lit up. Something suddenly flew out of the phone. Standing up, the guy realized that it was most likely a stage 1 monster. This thing was growing. It towered over the hero. His eyes widened as the monster continued to grow. In front of him stood a huge dragon. A notification appeared about its destruction and that he had 30 minutes to do so. The monster began to gather flames. The hero could not believe that it would happen so quickly. The monster spit out flames straight at the hero. He opened his eyes. In front of him was a message about the test failure. He was swinging on the floor, not knowing how to kill such a monster. He punched the floor, realizing that this was only the first stage, and this was a dragon monster whose combat power was incomparable, and besides, it was the dragon of destruction Fafnir, and if he was in the first stage, then would he really be ordered to fight a god in the 15th? The guy did not know if Transcendence could emerge victorious in a battle with gods, because it was unlikely, although perhaps they themselves could become gods. He imagined some gods, remembering that there were demigods too. The young man exhaled. Sitting on the floor, he couldn't decide what to do. Looking at his phone, only one thing made him happy. There was a notification on his phone that he could repeat the test, because he had 10 more attempts. Clutching the spear tighter, he understood that it was unlikely that anything would change in these 10 attempts. Walking to the door, he still decided to check who would win, him or the dragon. The hero's eyes turned white, because he had already spent 6 attempts, each time dying in less than 10 seconds. He rolled on the ground, knowing that he could not defeat such a monster. The sun was shining brightly. He realized that he was no longer himself. Sitting on the bench, he thought that he was far from being a professional hunter, not to mention a transcendent, so he needed to do at least something to increase the course progress, but he would be finished off before he could move, so there was no point in trying to increase the progress. While drinking his juice, he knew it was too late to refuse or change it to something else. A notification appeared on his phone saying that the hero could listen to an explanatory lecture. Taking the phone, he wondered if they could really tell him how to win. There were 3 options to choose from. The hero decided to choose the great sage Sanukun, since he could at least teach him something. He chose his course. A sage appeared, talking about the dragon Fafnir. Smiling, he explained that this was a task on attentiveness, due to which it caused some difficulties, but if you dig deeper, everything would be much easier. The guy looked at the phone while it continued to explain that many students were misled by his breathing, although this was both the beginning and the end of Fafnir. The hero understood that he had not seen this teacher for a long time, although at their first meeting he laughed at him, mistaking him for a cosplayer. Snapping his fingers, Sanukun explained that if you avoid breathing, everything will work out. A dragon appeared behind him and told him to watch more carefully. Looking at the dragon, he explained that there was no need to cut its breath. Frowning, he also added that the student was great if he could do it, but there was simply no need. The dragon spewed breath towards the teacher. He jumped over it, saying that after spewing the breath, Fafnir would not be able to use it for some time, because after that he could be considered an ordinary lizard. His eyes lit up. The hero looked at the phone when it said that now all that remained was to beat the monster. Sanukun swung his staff. His blow pierced the dragon through and through. The boy's eyes turned white when the teacher said that there was nothing difficult about it. Laughing, he added that even though the task tested the ability to understand the situation, this was only the first stage. The boy sat perplexed, listening to the words that the more difficult, the easier. Looking at the phone, the guy was puzzled, because maybe he just doesn't understand the meaning of the word explanation, or maybe transcendents have a different understanding of this word. It was a cloudy day, and the hero exclaimed that the rest of the lectures would really be like this. He chose another lecture. He looked at the phone, not understanding, because the lecturer was a dragon and advised using lightning breath. The hero bent over, not understanding how he could repeat this. Leaning back, he didn't know what to do. Looking at the phone, he realized that he had spent precious free coupons, and it would be annoying to retreat now. He saw Siegfried's lecture. He, like the hero featured in the Northern European myth of the Ring of the Nibelung, has an orthodox sword and is the strongest dragon slayer. It was the dragon Fafnir who gave him the opportunity to get such a title. The guy understood that the title of the lecture spoke for itself, because most likely it was he who would know the most about this monster, and if suddenly it turned out to be something strange again, then he would simply leave. The lecturer Siegfried appeared, saying that, as everyone already knew, the key to victory was breathing, and from this the question arose whether the students would be able to dodge it. The guy's eyes turned white again when the lecturer finished his lecture by saying that if they knew how to dodge the flame, then the goal was achieved, realizing that this was again useless material. Having already brought his finger closer to the screen, the lecturer again spoke about the fact that the students were watching the lecture, however, precisely because it was not so easy to dodge, and for this he would analyze the features of Fafnir and show a second way to achieve the goal. Raising his finger, Siegfried began with the first. The hero remembered the situation when the dragon killed him for the first time, listening to the lecturer's words about Fafnir spewing out breath where it is summoned, and if you summon it and quickly jump away, the breath will rush in that direction. He looked at the screen carefully, listening to him say that this is actually just a trick, but knowing this, you can easily dodge it. But even so, there may be those who find it difficult. The protagonist's eyes widened when he heard about the second method. The sun was shining brightly. Siegfried was explaining that a gold bar was needed. The door slammed shut and words of gratitude were heard. The guy held the gold bar in his hands, not understanding if this would work. Sitting back on the bench, the guy continued to listen to the words about how this bastard became a dragon because of the gold that filled his eyes, because he was extremely greedy. While showing how to throw, he explained that it didn't even have to be an ingot, even something similar would do, and after summoning Fafnir, you should immediately throw the gold into his nose. The hero looked at the screen in surprise when he explained that this monster wouldn't use his breath right away, because that could melt the gold. Smiling, the lecturer also said that the students might have a question about whether all this should be solved with skills. But what difference does it make when you can use a trick or your own skills, because the main thing is to find the right solution. The hero got up from the bench when he summed it up by saying that if they suddenly became interested in how to defeat other dragons, they could join his lectures on fencing, slaying dragons. The guy closed his eyes, realizing that one way or another, the initial capital requires investment. After pressing the summon button, a dragon appeared in front of him. It began to prepare to breathe fire. Sajin threw the ingot into his nose. He flew straight at the dragon. The monster noticed him. Noticing him, he followed him. The hero smiled, because he avoided the dragon's breath. The monster stood with its back to him. Taking him in its paw, it realized that it was only gilding. He turned around abruptly. A blow was flying at the guy. The monster did not stop hitting, and the hero could not understand where it could be a lizard. He lay on the ground, realizing that he had raised such a fuss, and lasted only a little more than a minute. The phone rang while he was trying to figure out how to win. He looked at the screen. There was a notification about the progress of Chiron's course. A bird was flying in the sky. The hero thought that maybe he should make golden armor. The protagonist jumped into the air, dodging the monster's blow. He landed on his paw, restricting the enemy's movements. A moment later, he quickly tilted his body to dodge. Sajin fell to the ground with a scream. He immediately got up and ran away. It was incredibly difficult for him to dodge the monster's attacks, which made him unable to hit it. The dragon swung its tail, attacking again. The monster's tail reached Sajin in a second. The guy reached for the bag, realizing that it was too late to dodge. The dragon froze, staring at the gold the guy threw. Its tail froze in the air and did not attack the protagonist. A moment later, the guy quickly ran away because the dragon resumed its attack. Sajin lay on the ground and sighed. He almost died just now. Suddenly, the dragon opened its mouth and roared loudly. The protagonist gritted his teeth, realizing that the monster was angry, realizing that the ingot was only gilded. The monster swung its paw, attacking the guy. Suddenly, the protagonist scattered the ingots, causing the dragon to freeze. Its eyes widened at the sight of so many gold ingots. Sajin quickly jumped up while the monster was looking at the gold. Once above the monster, he began to concentrate mana into the spear. Grabbing the spear with both hands, he began to chant a mantra. The guy began to fall at great speed onto the dragon's back. The monster's scales began to shine from the light of the spear. A moment later, Sajin landed on the dragon's back, delivering a powerful blow. The guy smiled widely, thinking that the attack was successful. Suddenly, the dragon turned its head and stared at him. Feeling the gaze behind him, the protagonist froze. A moment later, his blood spurted out of his body. The system notified the protagonist that he had failed the first stage. Sajin fell to the ground from powerlessness. The guy was trembling all over. He thought that he had already won, but everything turned out to be the opposite.